welcome everyone. I suppose you have been this fantastic conference. And it's a deep excitement after a year full of astrophysics, mathematics, computer sciences, conferences. At last, something we managed to at last, something that related, which I can relate to. So it's really exciting, and I think I know you all, even those who I haven't met, I've read. So I know you all. Some of you were students with me long time ago. I won't say when. Others are great friends and good colleagues from the past. Students. So it's really a great pleasure that we open this workshop organized by Yannick and his group. I spent a year here at the Institute amidst COVID. They didn't enjoy the full experience of the Institute, but they did some. So
We missed it. We missed it.
And I hope it will encourage some of you to apply as research fellows, either individuals or to create research groups. Take advantage of the fact that I'm still here for the next 3 years. After that, it might all pass again to the African. So take advantage of it and enjoy your conferences and I wish you a beautiful time. I'm going to spend some time with you, but since our board meeting starts on Tuesday, I'll be on it. But I will be around. So thanks for coming and enjoy your stay.
So, really happy to open this conference. It's been work in progress for quite a while. This conference is the culmination of work done by the Israel Institute for Advanced Studies Research Group titled Purity and Pollution in Late Antique and Medieval Society of Culture, which, as it's said, was a guest of the Institute for the years in 2021, 2022. It's now been a year since we've said our goodbyes. It was like yesterday. We were all here, and it's really great to see all the members of the group back here together, and also to see so many other friends. The group's main purpose was to bring together researchers who could look at questions of purity and pollution from a range of perspectives and try to breathe new life into this question that's become somewhat fossilized since Mary Douglas put it out in the 1960s. And as fate would have it, the year that we were here saw a relative explosion of scholarly interest on the subject of purity and pollution, with other groups in Israel and abroad working on the same topic. I'm happy to say that this blossomed into cooperation, and this is now the third time that we'll be speaking at one another's conferences. So it all turned out for the best, I think. There were also, like I've said, some less auspicious events taking place during the year that we were here, which turned out to be the last COVID lockdown somewhere around April 22. Which ground the work of the group to somewhat of a standstill. And actually forced us to postpone the conference, which was supposed to take place last June. But looking at all of you here now, I have to say that we probably took the right decision. And yeah, we're all here now, and that's what counts. I don't know that we've reached some overarching conclusion or answer to the questions that we were discussing during the year. I'm sure that the discussion we will have today will bring us at least somewhat closer to that conclusion. And as you can imagine, the organization of such a conference is a complicated thing to orchestrate, and it would not have been accomplished without the support and help of numerous people and organizations. First and foremost, I would like to thank the Israel Institute for Advanced Studies, firstly for hosting us during the year and becoming a home away from home, and also for giving us the logistical and material support for organizing this conference. On a more personal level, I would like to thank Yitzhak Ben, yes, the director, for his guidance and for his tireless help. Also, Iris Avivi for her astute navigation of organizational and personal obstacles. And of course, to Anat Yagi, without whom none of this would have been possible. I think I wrote her dozens of emails during the last few weeks, and she's always been helpful and cheerful. So thank you, Anat, for that. And finally, I would like to thank the Israel Science Foundation for their general grant of support for this conference. I hope we'll have stimulating talks and a chance to catch up and, of course, have some fun. And just two, I think, or maybe three announcements that off the top of my head. The first is, if you get the urge to make yourself coffee, keep in mind that this machine is rather loud. So if you want to do it discreetly, get your coffee outside. Okay. Secondly, the printed programs that you have are outdated. These are the newest ones. So we will pass them around, and whoever doesn't have the Google Drive version on hand should take a printed. Finally, for those of us who will be joining us on the last day for the tour of Jerusalem, as you probably noticed, Jerusalem weather is rather warm, so it would be maybe good for you to bring a change of convenient, comfortable clothes for the day tour, so that you don't have to trudge around in your conferencing clothes. That's pretty much it. So, with that in mind, let us turn to the first session, which I'm also moderating. So the first session of this conference and the first session of the day is Be Pure Faith. Since we have relatively ample time for paper to enter discussion, I suggest that we have a paper and then take questions immediately afterwards. That would give us 15 minutes for Q&A, and then we can put it to the next paper. But of course, any moderator, you would ever please. Our first speaker of the day is Deborah Tor. Debbie, from the Department of History at the University of Notre Dame. Professor Tor is a researcher of the political, social, religious, and military history of the medieval Middle East and Central Asia from the rise of Islam until the 13th century. He has numerous books, articles, and other publications, among which I will only mention the newest, The History and Culture of Iran and Central Asia.
The Islamic Byzantine border from the rise of Islam.
I was getting to that.
Oh, okay.
Which was edited by Debbie and Minoru Inaba and published last year by Notre Dame University Press, and the very, very newest Islamic Byzantine border in history from the rise of Islam to the end of the Crusades, which is coming out this year, or has it?
It has come out. It is out.
So, Edinburgh University Press. So Debbie has been a member of our research group, and it's really great to have her here again at the Institute. The title of her paper today is Purifying the Seljuk Past, the Turkish Mission in the Middle East.
Thank you. Do people want me to stay here, or should I move where? Can people see me? Sure. All right. So, the Seljuk dynasty, at the head of an army of Turkmens, that is Turkic pastoral nomads, for those of you who are not Islamicists, erupted into the Middle East in the 1030s. And over the course of the ensuing decades, conquered a dominion that extended not only over the central Islamic lands between the Oxus River and the Mediterranean Sea, but also territories deep into Central Asia. In doing so, the Seljuks became the only pre-modern non-caliphal dynasty, Muslim dynasty, ever to reunite and rule over the entire Middle East, an area of 1.5 million square miles. And the Seljuks continued to dominate the political, cultural, and religious life of the Islamic world from Anatolia to India and Central Asia until the late 12th century. Seljuk rule was also noteworthy for another significant achievement. It inaugurated the beginning of foreign Turco-Mongol dominion over the mainly Arabic and Persian-speaking lands and peoples of the region, an alien military and political colonization which would last for nearly 900 years until the Europeans during World War I came and replaced that colonial dominion with their own. It is therefore in historical significance, second only to the Caliphate itself in importance. While the Seljuk conquest itself was a violent exploitation of brute force and opportunity, The Seljuk sultans, once they found themselves ruling a vast Islamic empire, needed a legitimizing rationale, and also a means of persuading the autochthonous leaders of civil society, local notables, administrators, and religious figures to support and participate in what was essentially an alien Turkic project. For the Seljuk Turkmens were no administrators. These warlords, thus, for their administrative elite, adopted and utilized the native, ethnically Iranian Khorasani bureaucratic elite that was already there in place. Several contemporaneous texts record that the Seljuks accomplished this co-optation of the Khorasanis and achieved a legitimizing ideology by sanitizing and redefining their imperial project as one that not only was, but that they retroactively claimed always had been a religious undertaking in the service of establishing pure religion, haq din, or right religion in the Islamic lands, defined as adherence to the Hanafi religious denomination, madhab. We begin to find evidence of the adoption of this retrojective jihad to uphold the pure Islam already in the reign of Alp-Arslan, the second great Seljuk Sultan, who ruled from 1063 to 1072, some 30 years after the commencing of the Turkmen conquest. The purpose of this presentation will be therefore threefold. First, to show the fact that the original Seljuk conquest, as documented in the sources, neither looked like nor purported to be the religious mission they later claimed that it had been. Second, to show the post facto ideological religious justification for their rule, which the Seljuks adopted, and its success in obtaining Khorasani support for and unity of purpose with the Seljuk regime. And finally, to show also the unintended consequences of this ideology of partisan Hanafism that it had on the internal peace of their realm and its long-term flourishing. Let us begin with the record of the Seljuk conquest itself and what the Seljuks claimed in their earliest recorded correspondence with the Caliph al-Qaim, who wrote to reprove them for their behavior. Thus, the sources report the continuous and calamitous harrying of the Islamic world during the latter part of the late 1030s by the main Seljuk armies, relating, quote, the Seljuk Oghuz, when they appeared in Khorasan, destroyed, plundered, and wrecked the country and took people into captivity. King Chadribek destroyed the environs of Marv and its villages. The Turkmens stretched out their hand and unleashed cutting of the roads and terror and tumult, and they made the regions of Khorasan disturbed and disordered, and so forth. While most scholars are aware of the chaotic nature of Turkmen behavior before the Battle of Damran Khan in 1040, which transformed the Seljuks from nomadic raiders to the rulers of settled Muslim populations, not many are aware that violent Turkmen behavior continued long after that battle. Throughout the 1040s, their conduct still resembled more that of General Sherman's army on its march to the sea, rather than that of a statesman-like Muslim government towards its Muslim population. Thus, the sources continue to be strewn with descriptions such as the following. Quote, Chadribek gathered together a numerous army of Turkmens, and he came and looted places in Khorasan. They came against the city of Dalban, and they destroyed it utterly. They invaded the city of Rey and destroyed it utterly. For the Oghuz gained mastery over all of Khorasan, and there then transpired their violation of all honor, their repudiation of decency, and their killing of the notables, which passed all bounds. In 1046, when the Oghuz conquered Iran, they burned down the city, quote, tortured the men until they brought out all their hidden treasures and gave those to them, and they committed fornication with their wives before their eyes, and they deflowered their virgins. While another source reports, quote, the enslavement of a myriad of its inhabitants. Regarding the conquest of Rey in 1043, Ibn al-Jawzi reports that Togrul's followers destroyed Rey. Only 3,000 souls survived there, and the gates of the mosque were sealed up. The litany of destruction is long and includes other atrocities such as the burning of the mosque of Mara'a and the killing of many of its inhabitants, the slaughter of supposedly 100,000 people in Tus, the plundering of Kirman, and many more such violent deeds. Although there is some disagreement in the sources regarding when the Seljuks first opened correspondence with the Caliph, with reports of the date of this ranging from after their first victory over the Ghaznavid armies in 1037 to after their decisive victory at Damran Khan in 1040, or even only as late as 1043 or 1044, some 6 years later. At some point, either the Seljuks opened this correspondence or the Caliph himself wrote to reprimand them. And the Seljuks in turn found it necessary to tender their obedience offer their excuses as to why they had dislodged the legitimate caliphal patent holder, the Ghaznavid Sultan Masoud, and to ask for the caliphal qaim's recognition. It is noteworthy that in these earliest recorded pleas of legitimacy, while the Seljuks enumerate a long list of justifications referring to their prowess in jihad, Mahmud of Ghazna's imprisonment in the past of their uncle, Arslan Israel, and his death in captivity, the claim that Mahmud's successor, Masoud, had neglected his kingly duties in order to indulge in amusement and frivolities, to the point where, so they claimed, the notables and religious scholars of Khorasan had asked them to come and extend their protection over the province, that Masoud's army had repeatedly attacked them, the Seljuks, who were merely innocent and laudable Ghazis, jihad fighters. They never claimed to be on a divine mission to establish right religion and purify Islam through the championing of the Hanafi madhab at this point. And here a word is in order regarding a particular religious development in which the Seljuks were to play an important role and which is integral to this new legitimizing claim. The Seljuk championing of religious purity is intimately connected with the final crystallization of Sunni Islam, which had been completed in the late 10th century with the formation of the Sunni madhab or religious denomination. While the word madhab is usually translated as school of law, this translation, while not incorrect, is inadequate, since it fails to capture the theological, social, and religious components that were integral elements of the madhab, making it all-encompassing in much the same fashion as the different post-Reformation Protestant sects, which didn't see the differences amongst themselves as small at all. The salient aspect of this new prominence of the madhab is that there was no concept in the 11th and 12th centuries, as is common today, that all four present-day Sunni schools of law or madhabs are equally valid. On the contrary, first of all, there were more than 4 Sunni madhabs in this period. And second, it was obvious to all at the time that there could only be one true path of Islam, since the Prophet himself had to have had only one way of doing things. Everything else that was not his way, therefore, must be wrong, inauthentic, and even heretical. The Seljuks, when they entered the Middle East, entered a world, therefore, of rising, internecine Sunni animosity or ta'assub. And as we shall see, one of the milieus in which this partisanship was apparently most fierce was that of the Khorasani Hanafi bureaucratic classes with whom the Seljuks wished to ally themselves. There's no evidence that the Seljuks embraced the radical Hanafi partisanship, even though they were Hanafis, of the Khorasanis before they themselves entered the Central Islamic lands and conquered them. Certainly none of their earliest reported letters or statements expound this theology or mission. It would thus appear that the Seljuks absorbed perhaps militant Hanafi exclusivity, this ta'assub, from their Khorasani Hanafi surroundings after they entered, which cemented the pact they made with the native Iranian Khorasani governing class some years after the establishing of their rule. Indeed, the first evidence we see of Hanafi partisanship or ta'assub took place in the year 1053, during the reign of the first Seljuk Sultan Toghrul-Beg, and it was an initiative of the leader of the Hanafi Khorasani bureaucratic class with which the Seljuks had allied themselves, namely his vizier al-Kunduri, and it took place without the approval of the Seljuk Sultan. Whereas the Sultan, in order to demonstrate his religious orthodoxy and zeal, had permitted the vizier to order the ritual cursing of the Shiites in the mosques of Khorasan, al-Kunduri, of his own initiative, that's explicitly stated in the sources, added the Shafi'is, the Sunni Shafi'i madhab, for good measure, subsequently imprisoning one of the major Shafi'i religious leaders of the day, Abu Qasim al-Qushairi, and inducing the flight of a second, Imam al-Haramain al-Juwayni. It should be noted that the sources, again, explicitly attribute this Hanafi partisanship to the vizier rather than to the sultan. I quote, al-Kunduri was strong in partisanship against the Shafi'i madhab, fighting many battles against the Shafi'i. His partisanship went so far that he asked the sultan to permit the cursing of the Shiites upon the minbars of Khorasan, who allowed this. So al-Kunduri ordered the cursing, but added to them the Shafi'is. But the people of Khorasan rejected this with disdain. Among them, the Imam Abu, in other words, Shafi'i people rejected this. Imam Abu Qasim al-Qushairi and the Imam Abu al-Ma'ali al-Juwayni, and others apart from these two, so that they departed from Khorasan. It is significant that it is the representative of the Khorasani bureaucratic fashion rather than the Seljuk sultans and military leaders who were the originators of this ardent crusading Hanafism. We do not read of Toglebek himself, although of course Hanafi justifying Seljuk rule on those specifically partisan grounds. It is in fact not until Alp Arslan's time, that is between AD 1063 and 1072, over 2 decades after the Battle of Dandal Khan, that any source reports the Seljuk embrace of a Hanafi purifying mission as both a religious sanitizing of their conquest past and a justification of their present rule, along with the accompanying Hanafi partisanship also. The earliest reported instance is in fact found in the Siyar al-Muluk, the Mirror for Princes written by the great Seljuk Vizier Nizam al-Mulk, completed around the year AD 1091. Nizam al-Mulk was one of those Iranian Khorasani bureaucrats serving 2 successive sultans, Alp Arslan and his son Malik Shah. He is, however, anomalous because he was of the despised Shafi'i rather than the Hanafi persuasion. The story he relates is thus doubly interesting, since the author was not only an eyewitness to the events he describes, but also a religious outsider who would not have viewed these activities with approval. In this episode from the Siyar al-Muluk, the author recounts how the Sultan Alp Arslan, having discovered that one of his important Turkmen commanders, Erdem, had hired a Shiite as personal secretary. And so he first had the Shiite beaten until he was half dead, then summoned the entire inner circle of Turkish magnates in order to reprimand Erdem publicly and to appeal to his Turkmen elite in the following words. Quote, then the Sultan turned his face to the magnates and said, it is not the fault of this vile wretch, that is the Shiite, but the fault of Erdem, who has taken a heretic of corrupt madhab, bad madhab is the word, into his service. I have said to you once and twice and 100 times that you Turks are the army of Khorasan and Transoxiana. Yet in these regions, you are aliens. And this realm we have taken by the sword and victory because we are all pure Muslims. Dailam and the people of Iraq, and here it should be said, they conquered the Iraqi. This is Iraq and today's Iran. In other words, Western Iran at that time, the areas outside of Khorasan. For the most part, are of wicked madhab, wicked belief, and wicked religion. And today, God, may he be glorified and exalted, has held the Turks dear and bestowed rulership upon them because the Turks are pure Muslims, Muslimanan Pakizea, and are not acquainted with heresy and innovation. And they, the Dailamites and Iraqis, are conversely all heretics and of bad madhab and enemies of the Turks. As long as they are weak, they will remain obedient and render service. But if in any fashion they were to take power and weakness were to appear in the affairs of the Turks, both for religious and political reasons, not one of us Turks would remain alive. You are a Turk. You must have a Khorasani retinue and household and secretary and assistants should all be Khorasani. And the same should apply to all the Turks so that the rule of the Turks be not damaged. In this passage, Alp Arslan is in fact expounding a new post facto ideological justification of Turkmen and Seljuk rule, based upon what he considers the religiously pure Hanafi beliefs of the Turkmens. Indeed, he actually claims here that God vouchsafed him the task of ruling over the empire solely for the purpose of upholding pure religion. The historical veracity of this passage, if not in its particulars, certainly in the stances and beliefs it conveys, is given particular credence by the fact that Nizam al-Mulk was not himself a Hanafi, but a despised Shafi, and elsewhere in his work, on more than one occasion in fact, he states that his own position was precarious and his loyalty suspect because of that fact. At one point stating, for example, quote, and I for that reason, because he regarded his madhab with such seriousness and firm belief, and held the Shafi'ite madhab in dishonor. I lived in continual worry and fear of him. The important point is that we see her a byproduct of the sanitizing ideological mission and justification that the Seljuks assumed and then retrojected upon their past. It led to the inflaming of concomitant bigotry against and even persecution of non-Hanafi Sunnis, most notably Shafi'is. Although this bigotry was introduced, as we have seen, by the Khorasani Hanafi bureaucrats, it was by Alp Arslan's time at the latest, wholeheartedly adopted and embraced by the Seljuk rulers and military elite as well. Indeed, By the early 12th century, leading Shafi'i religious luminaries narrowly escaped imprisonment or worse at the hands of the Seljuk Sultan and his zealous Hanafism. One such case is that of Al-Qiyad al-Haras, the most famous teacher of the day in the Nizamiya Madrasa of Baghdad, who was falsely accused on a trumped-up charge of Ismailism in the year 1100 and thrown into prison by the Seljuk Sultan himself. It took direct caliphal intervention to save the Shafi'ite leader. Thus, the chronicler Ibn al-Athir relates, quote, Al-Qiyad al-Haras, the lecturer in the Nizamiya Madrasa, was suspected of being a Batini, and this was conveyed about him to Sultan Muhammad, who then ordered his arrest, but the Caliph al-Mustathir billah sent to have him freed and testified on his behalf regarding the soundness of his beliefs and his high rank in religious knowledge, so he was released. Another example is that of the great Shafi'ite Muslim theologian Abu Hamid al-Ghazali, who was accused before then regional Sultan Sanjar of having slandered Abu Hanifa and therefore being a religious heretic. He was therefore ordered to appear before the Sultan, probably in the year 1108 or 1109, to clear himself of these serious charges. So thoroughly did the Seljuks embrace this legitimizing mission of religious purification that they in fact became known to contemporaneous and subsequent generations of Muslim historians for this characteristic. Thus, for instance, the earliest chronicler of the dynasty, the Hanafi Zahr ad-Din Nishapuri, in his Seljuk-Name, which was composed around 1176 during the reign of the last great Seljuk Sultan, states, it is well known that in the Islamic community after the Sahaba and the Rashidun caliphs, there were no kings who were greater or more worthy of ruling over humanity than the kings of the house of Seljuk. How many good works were manifested in the days of their dynasty? The revival of the signs of religion, the raising high of the articles of faith of the Muslims, the building and creating of mosques, madrasas, ribats, bridges and stipends, the bestowal of al-qaf upon the ulama, ascetics, and holy people, which had never been in any period before. They set an example for the kings of the age, commanding the ghazwa, the jihad against the infidels, and the smiting and chastisement of the people of innovation and wickedness, and because of their strengthening of the articles of religion. In similar vein, the Hanafi dynastic chronicler Muhammad bin Ali al-Rawandi, who wrote in the last decade of the 12th century, immediately after the end of the Great Seljuk dynasty, attributes the fall of the dynasty to the fact that the Seljuks had become religiously lax, so that, quote, oppressors espousing bad religion, Ba'ad-Din, that phrase again, all Shiite or Shafi'ite, slipped into the army of the Sultan, and by these means they took rule into their hand. One sees in this excerpt that Rawandi apparently shared Sultan Alp Arslan's views, expressed views regarding the existential importance of this shared mission of the Seljuk military elite and the Khorasani bureaucracy to uphold their Hanafi version of Islamic religious purity, the result of letting non-Hanafis, but especially Shiites and Shafi'ites, who are on the same level, into the ranks of the elite and the apparatus of the polity was inevitably the downfall of the dynasty. The success of this legitimizing ideology is seen in its embrace not only by sultans and their chroniclers, but also by Seljuk officialdom, bureaucrats of all levels who were zealous in the cause of pure religion, that is Hanafism, and especially against its greatest rival, Shafi'ism. We find confirmation of this in the fact that not only Hanafi historians cite approvingly the Hanafi bigotry of the Seljuk administration, but also contemporaneous Shafi'i historians of the period complain of it. A case in point is found in the writings of one of the most important Seljuk era historians, Imad ad-Din al-Isfahani, who wrote a dynastic history of the Seljuks, Nusrat al-Fatra. Isfahani was born in Isfahan in 1125, and both there and in Baghdad, he studied at the Shafi'i Nizamiya madrasas. He then held professional posts in the bureaucracy under the Caliphal Vizier Ibn Mubayrak before moving to Syria in 1167, where he eventually became secretary to the more religiously congenial great Ayyubid ruler Saladin. Isfahani recounts an episode which occurred during the period of the Vizierate of Diya al-Mulk bin Nizam al-Mulk, Sultan Muhammad Taqer's vizier between 1106 and 1110. So that's how we can date the period in which it occurred. In this episode, the civil administrator, the Amid of Baghdad, Muhammad al-Juzakhani, one of the Seljuk administration's grandees, is severely criticized for embracing Seljuk Khorasani legitimizing partisanship. Quote, this Muhammad al-Juzakhani was the son of the Khatib of Juzakhan, Khorasani by birth and origin, and the only desideratum for him was his Khorasaniness. Khorasaniyatihi is the phrase, not his humanity. Insaniyatihi. This, by the way, is, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, friends, the first expression of insaniyat, of this idea of humanity or human-wide as an expression, a medieval Arabic expression. There are scholars who have thought that actually it's an invention of the modern period, but we can find it in these texts, and in fact, in different texts from different places. So it's not an interjection or a retrojection by some kind of later editor. He became acquainted with the Sultan through the Hanafi madhab and his stirring up discord by means of it, and his unrestrainedness in partisanship. So when anyone greeted him, he was not heard to return the greeting until he had said to him, "What is your madhab among the people of Islam?" He passed all boundary in his partisanship to the madhab and his backbiting, causing riots to rise like raising camels by his contentiousness. Note that this figure's Hanafi partisanship is explicitly said to have been the means of introduction to the Seljuk Sultan Muhammad Taqar, and to have formed the basis of the bond between them, and by extension between those two disparate groups which form the Seljuk elite, the Turkish magnates and the Iranian Khorasani bureaucrats and administrative officials. The vehement dislike of the Shafi'ite chronicler Imad ad-Din, both for Juzef Kahani's Khorasaniness and for his Hanafi partisanship, is also abundantly apparent in this passage, an indication of the drawbacks of this legitimizing strategy of the Seljuk Khorasani alliance and legitimizing strategy. For there was a price to the embrace of this ideology of purity of religion, or in other words, militant and partisan Hanafism. While the mission of religious purification indeed served to whitewash and justify the Seljuk conquest and to provide a binding glue between that Turkic military elite and its Iranian bureaucrats, it also, however, greatly inflamed the already high partisan tensions of the times and resulted in outbreaks of violence between the Hanafis and the adherents of rival Sunni religious schools, Hanbalism in Baghdad and Shafi'ism nearly everywhere else. One of the more characteristic forms of this Hanafi supremacism war was intermittent government-sanctioned actual persecution of Shafis. We've already seen the notorious case of Togrobek's vizier, Amid al-Mulk al-Kunduri, his cursing of Shafi'ites, and the imprisonment and flight of major Shafi religious leaders. A more serious but lesser known case is the anti-Shafi'ite inquisition and persecution under the suffragan sultan of the Iraqain, the two Iraqs, that is from Iraq up to the Oxus River, basically, practically, Sultan Mas'ud in the year 1142 in several of the major cities of the empire. The dynastic historian Bundari reports as follows on the persecution in Isfahan, which resulted in a wave of conversions from Shafi'ism to Hanafism. Saad Dawla Yarun Kush was in charge of Isfahan, and the Emir Gulbek was his deputy. And they had a league among them of fanatical partisanship, asabiya, against the Shafi'iyya, and drawing nearer to Allah in the wrong which connected them. And they afflicted the adherents of the Shafi'i with various kinds of tribulations throughout the whole country, and dedicated themselves to the attacking and the banishing of them. They attempted to suppress the Shafi's madhab, and they openly deemed themselves superior. They wanted to extinguish Shafi's light. They afflicted the leaders of the madhab in every town so that there did not remain one of them. Consequently, there entered into the madhab of Abu Hanifa a group in search of dignity or rank, and in fear of their persecutors, not of Allah. A useful outside check, neither Hanafi nor Shafi'i, regarding this particular anti-Shafi'ite inquisition is provided by one of our very earliest sources, which you both are familiar with, of course, Qazvini's mid-12th century Kitab al-Naqs, a Shiite polemical work written in the third quarter of the 12th century, which notes that in Rey at this time, Sultan Mas'ud himself is said to have instituted the anti-Shafi'i inquisition, during the course of which he had the leading Shafi'i clerics imprisoned, tortured, and fined, then forced them to perform a public recantation of doctrinal views that were not congruent with Hanafi doctrine, and made them sign documents to that effect, which were then circulated throughout the Seljuk lands, in tandem with persecutions of Shafis in other cities, most notably Isfahan, as we have already seen, and Baghdad. A few years later, in AD 1148, the same anti-Shafi'i partisanship resulted in a civil war in the province of Persian Iraq, that is modern-day Iran. The governor of Isfahan at the time, Najm ad-Din al-Ghiyathi, is described by Gundari as having been fanatically bigoted against the Shafi'ites. When therefore the local Shafi'ite headman backed a Seljuk commander in his rebellion against the Sultan, and the governor Najmuddin sent to arrest all those who had backed the rebel, the masses, presumably the Hanafi masses, encouraged by this anti-Shafi'i governor, marched upon the Shafi'i Nizamiya Madrasa of the city, plundered it, set fire to its library, and burned it down. Thus, we see here another aspect of the consequences of the Seljuk championing of this pure religion, which characterized the 11th and 12th centuries. Namely, one of the results of this embrace of a Hanafi-based legitimizing ideology was that the madhab, already the locus of Sunni religious identity, became the source of hyper-partisanship, frequently leading to violence among Sunni madhabs. It is noteworthy that whereas in the decades prior to the Seljuk conquest of Baghdad, which is the city for which we have the most extensive information, Sunni Shiite riots were the dominant form of social strife. Within months of Toghrul Beg's arrival, internal Sunni conflict was already rearing its head and became in fact far more prevalent than those Sunni Shiite street battles. For each madhab was convinced that its own way was the sole true Islam as taught by the Prophet, and that all others therefore were espousing religious error and required correction or suppression. Internecine Sunni violence was consequently the hallmark of the era. And it should be emphasized that this did not remain confined to Hanafis versus all others once it started spreading. Rather, this violent partisanship among Sunni madhabs became universal. Thus, the animosity in Baghdad between Shafi'ites and Hanbalites, for example, is also well attested. In the very year of the Seljuk conquest of the city, there was a riot between Shafi'ite and Hanbalite fuqaha, the religious leaders in Baghdad, over their differing prayer practices. And the Hanbalites, with the support of their Muslims, went to the mosque in the Shafi'ite Barley Gate quarter and prevented the imam from reciting aloud the Bismillah, which was a Shafi'ite prayer practice. On other occasions, the Shafi'is were the instigators of madhab-based violence. In 1077, the Sufi al-Qushairi son of Nasr, who was a firebrand Shafi'i partisan, came to Baghdad on his way to Mecca, preached in the Nizamiya Madrasa, and provoked confrontations by insulting and condemning the Hanbalites in his sermons. Note, by the way, obviously under this partisan Hanafi government, they didn't dare preach against Hanafis. They were only preaching against Hanbalis, which is also interesting in itself. Ibn al-Athir writes, quote, "There occurred because of him fitnas with the Hanabila, because he spoke in favor of the Shafis in the Nizamiya Madrasa. His followers and partisans were numerous, but nevertheless, his Hanbalite opponents, together with their followers, attacked the Nizamiya Madrasa market and killed a number of people, and matters became grave between the two parties. So these deadly riots continued into the following year, 1078, when, so the sources tell us, quote, there was a fitna again between the people of the Madrasa market and the Tuesday market, respectively Shafi'ite and Hanbalite neighborhoods, because of religious beliefs, and they plundered one another's neighborhoods. Mu'ayyad al-Mulk, son of Nizam al-Mulk, was in a house that was part of the Madrasa. He sent for the civilian governor, the Amir, and the prefect, who both came with troops, beat the people, and a group of them from both sides were killed, and they dispersed. Even after that, we see that inter-madhab tension continued simmering. Full-scale fitna between, once again, Hanbalis and Shafis erupted in Baghdad in 1082, after an inflammatory Shafi'ite preacher in the Nizamiya Madrasa reaverred that the Hanbalites were infidels, kuffar. So this type of religious violence remained endemic with sporadic outbursts until the very end of Seljuk rule. And this brings us to a final historiographical point. The centering of group identity throughout the 11th and 12th centuries in the Central Islamic lands around the locus of the madhab, and the Seljuk inflaming of partisanship through their use of Hanafism in order both to justify their own conquests and occupation, and to find a common rallying point with the Khorasani bureaucratic class whose cooperation they needed, is a phenomenon that has been overlooked by many scholars or misinterpreted. And here one should mention first and foremost George Makdisi, whose rejection of the identification of the Seljuks with Sunni revivalism is based almost entirely on his mistaken conflation of the championing of the Caliph with the championing of Sunnism. He did not appear to realize that the two are decidedly distinct. And by his litmus test, in fact, The great Al-Ghazali himself absurdly would not qualify as the Sunni champion, since after his conversion, he eschewed the caliph and refused to have any contact with him, as his Persian letters state quite explicitly. The other scholar who notably overlooked the nature and importance of this madhab-based partisanship was Richard Bullitt, who maintained in his Patricians of Nishapur that madhab identification was merely a blind or a pretext for politically motivated local oligarchic politics. That theory, however, does not withstand examination either, for it does not take into account that such factionalism was not local and not limited to Nishapur, but rather universal throughout the entire Islamic world at this time and espoused by sultans, not just local notables. In the end, in fact, unchecked partisanship assisted uncontrolled Turkic nomads and warlords in bringing about serious damage to and even the actual destruction of major cities in the dying days of Seljuk rule in the latter part of the 12th century, not just Nishapur, but also, for instance, Isfahan, which suffered major devastation around the turn of the Julian year 1165, when a war between the Shafis and the other madhabs broke out. Quote, there occurred in Isfahan a great fitna among the members of the madhabs, ashab al-madhahib is the phrase, due to the partisanship of the madhabs. The battle between the two sides lasted for 8 days straight. In it, there were killed many people, and many of the houses and markets were burnt down and destroyed. Then they dispersed in most infamous fashion. In the final years of Seljuk rule, both Isfahan and Rey suffered further unbridled outbreaks against the Shafis. This is essentially after Seljuk rule had ended there. Thus, in 1186, quote, there transpired in Isfahan between the Shafi'iyya and the Hanafiya wars, killing, plundering, and burning, that which is beyond description. And in the city of Rey, also there was a great fitna between the Sunnah and the Shia, and its population was scattered, and some among them were killed, and that city and others in the land were destroyed. Indeed, regarding Rey, the 13th century geographer Yakut, who visited the city in 1220 before the Mongols had touched it, noted that Rey had already been largely destroyed. First, by internecine warfare between Sunnis and Shiites, which we just saw, but then after the Sunnis had won, by an all-out war between the Hanafis and the Shafi'is. In conclusion, we have seen that the Seljuks, some 2 decades after their original conquest, adopted an ideology of their rule as a God-given mission of upholding pure Islam as instantiated in the Hanafi madhab. While this served both to sanitize their ugly past history of violent conquest and to sanctify and justify their dominion thereafter, and also enabled them to find a common cause with the native Khorasani elite, especially the bureaucrat class, so necessary to their rule, there was a terrible downside to this strategy. It exacerbated the already inflamed madhab-based religious partisanship of the time, resulted in the religious persecution of Shafis and Shafiism in particular, and at the close of the Seljuk period, in the final decades of the 12th century, proved devastatingly destructive to some of the most important cities of the Eastern Islamic world. Thank you.
Thank you, Debbie, for that fascinating of the religious policy that backfired.
Well, had side effects, unintended side effects, shall we say. It worked. It worked.
Did it though? I mean, if I can start off the discussion, well, at least when I try to compare incoming forces that try to adopt the religion of the local population, obviously, what comes to mind. Usually the policy is one of attempting to unify the population. And were they aware of the possible side effects of adopting this kind of radical policy? Or was this something that came out of the blue? I mean, they had 20 years to think this thing through, right? From when they came until this thing started to get rolling. So they must have known the deep fissures within the society and what this policy could bring. So I'm trying to understand the rationale.
Because I think perhaps the difficulty here is that you're regarding it as a policy, but it's an ideology that they're embracing, not a policy. And so, they were Hanafis, they were primitive Central Asian nomads, not very sophisticated, and they found already this Hanafi partisanship amongst the Khorasani clerics and bureaucrats, and they embraced it and they adopted it. Yes, it was also a useful ideology that also helped them to unify with this bureaucratic class and get them on board.
The main component.
I don't think we can tell that. Maybe it was at first, but there's no question, I think, but that they believed it. I mean, when we read about the persecutions of sultans in the 12th century, actually arresting Hanafi as Shafi'i clerics, they had to have believed that. And they couldn't not have seen the other effects by that point, because when you have, a civil war going on in your cities between Hanafis and Shafis, then you know that it's going to be a consequence. But clearly they believed it. And the sources report, for example, when they're talking about that really partisan guy who won't say hello until he finds out if the guy's a Hanafi or not, that's how he met the Sultan. And that's how they bonded together. So the Sultan clearly is equally bigoted.
Are the sources Khorassani or are they Seljuk, or is that?
They're both, and that's what's so great about them, is that, we have both the Shafi and the Hanafi and even Shiite, a really important Shiite source at the time. And in fact, the Shiite source, why does it adduce all of this partisanship between Hanafis and Shafis? Because it's trying to claim that Shiites are just another one of the madhahib. And on that basis, they're saying, well, yeah, people call us heretics, but look, they call each other heretics too. So, Shafiites also are being called heretics and persecuted, and you guys admit that they're Sunni, so we're really A-okay as well. That's really the purpose of that book, but it reports all this incredible historical information for areas that we don't have it for otherwise.
In the persecution, what was the end game here to get people to convert, to
Yes.
leave their madhabs? and
Yes,
come over
yes, to become Hanafi, to espouse and to further and to promote the right religion. So it's kind of an extension of, just as, the purpose of a ruler in Islam is, right, this twofold duty of basically ordering the world aright, as Kroner writes, in God's rule, that internally within the Islamic world is commanding right and forbidding wrong. In other words, making sure that people behave the way they're supposed to, and outside jihad to bring them to recognize Allah and the rule of God. And so once you start identifying the rule of God, not just with sort of all Islam is okay, but no, this is the only real Islam. So then it's really an extension of that duty.
May I ask a connecting question? I was wondering, I wanted to know, are there conversions reported in the sources?
Well, yeah, one of those, I told you, I mean, that point of that conversion, it says that a lot of people converted
Okay.
to Hanafism, not because they believed it, but because they wanted either status or because they were free.
Are they anecdotal? Is this the only mass conversion, or are there many? Are they always mass conversions, or are they individuals as well?
The problem is what sources choose to report and
Mhm.
why. I haven't been looking in the biographical literature for instances of people who converted from Shafi'ism to Hanafism. I probably should go back and do that, but it wasn't on my radar screen originally when I was looking at ulama biographies in the period.
And my final little question,
That's
I'll
the
I'll
question.
open up, is just whether they are ever treated as miraculous conversions, or are they always for a rational?
No,
reason?
those are in detail, but again, it's, I think, the nature of the text. In other words, the only time that we read about miracle stories and conversions that we start seeing in literature in the Seljuk period, usually with Sufis, when they're talking, like the very famous biography of Ahmed Jam, or or Shirazi before that. So those tend to report because it's part of their whole hagiography of the Sufi guy. But this isn't that type of literature.
Right.
So maybe such literature at one point existed and we just don't know, it hasn't survived.
Mhm.
And we haven't seen it, or maybe there wasn't anyone who was, odd enough to write it down, who knows? So I think we can't argue here from silence, because these are the sources mostly that I'm looking at are not the kind of sources that we have had.
Right, okay, thank you.
So we'll take both of them, Della and Chris, and then,
And Ed, don't forget Ed.
oh,
Should I start?
yes.
Yeah. Thank you for your fascinating
Please
papers.
finally meet you.
I've got two questions. The first is, when does this strife among Sunni madhabs start? Is it a new phenomenon in such a period? Is it related perhaps to the earlier Buyyid domination, when we had a Shiite domination? Just to this further, this inter-Sunni strife?
Right.
The first question. The second would be, you mentioned the anti-Shafi'ite Inquisition in the 1140s. What word or what term is used for the Inquisition? Is it Nichna, as used by
Yes.
in the Abbasid period? Do they refer to that? Are they do
Depends
they,
which
do they
source.
know what's happened before, or do they imitate this, or is it a new development?
Yeah. They don't give it. Kitab al-Naqd doesn't give it a term, it doesn't call it a mihna, but it doesn't, it says this is what the Sultan was doing. They're arguing, look at how they treat the Shafi'ites, and this is what he's doing. And we know from the Sunni sources, they're saying in this period, they'll call it Asabiyya. So they were not directly relating it back to, al-Ma'mun's. Regarding your first question.
But it's called Mihna, the same term is used for this.
Mihna, I believe, I'm trying to remember which source I saw them actually use that, but no one mentions al-Ma'mun, no one mentions the Mu'tazila, no one talks about anything like that. Most of them don't use a term. They'll just, other than asabi or ta'assub, they'll say, look at this expression of ta'assub. Certainly the non-Hanafi ones all do that. But regarding your first question, so we don't see the riots amongst Sunnis as opposed to, fitnas between Sunnis and Shiites. Yes, they come to the fore during the Buyid period. That I've written about extensively. And they come to the fore in the Buyid period, I think, because of the fact that Shiites for the first time were allowed publicly to express their religious practices. And one of the very first things that the Seljuks did when they conquered Baghdad is Ibn al-Athir states specifically, they banned public Shiite rites. They banned the Shiite azan from the mosques. They banned the public celebration of Ashura, hanging of Musah in the mosques, in the bazaars, etc. And so because they were sort of restored to their proper place, if you will, in Sunni eyes, those fitnas die out. And suddenly, from the very beginning of the Seljuk appearance, we see this, war between Shafis and Hanbalis appearing. And then, of course, subsequently, this Hanafi supremacy over everyone. So the intra-Sunni madhab, part of that we can ask, okay, so it took that expression because they no longer had to put cheese in their place, but they were already accustomed or became accustomed to having these fitnas and these outbreaks of popular partisanship. Perhaps. I think it was also, though, intimately connected with the fostering of the madhab. I mean, one of the things I published a little bit about this one in the article that I had in Dar es Salaam on Seljuk religion. Is that, yes, it's true, and this is where Maqdisi, I think, went awry. I mean, Hallam has pointed out that, yes, we find the first madrasas appearing in the last quarter of the 10th century, but those are very rare, and they're sort of a private foundation, and it's kind of a one-off, and they don't appear all over. That this realization that the madrasa is such a wonderful tool to counteract the Fatimids and to promote proper religion, and that now that Sunnism has been fully formed and has this idea of how you give someone ijaza and pass on this chain of transmission, they needed an institution in which to do it. And so that really becomes very popularized during the Seljuk period. We start reading of the endowment and the spreading of madrasas on a large scale in the Seljuk period. And so I think that Maqdisi was wrong. The fact that an institution exists, if it's not widespread and it's not used before then, well, that's not terribly useful. And there can be no question, I think, that was very associated with this development of hyperpartisanship. One of the things I've noticed in the chronicles, for example, is that it's only when we get to the Seljuk period that they start saying, identifying by madhab, an alim who dies, that so-and-so P of Hanafi, P of Shafi. And you don't have those descriptors prior to that. So I think that's also an indication of this kind of partisanship becoming much more salient in this point. Did that answer your question?
It does, yeah, thanks.
Okay, so our next question is from Viviana. We do have a lot of questions and not a lot of time, so
I'll try to keep yours.
Thank you, Debbie. Very interesting. I'd like to ask you if you don't want to throw into the analysis of the historiography, the Turkish Arab or Turkish Arab Persian competition and rivalry. That's one. Two, as far as I remember, the Seljuks also presented themselves as those who lead the jihad against the Byzantines, against the Christians.
Absolutely.
So how would you evaluate the weight of their jihad against the outer enemy and their inner mission? That's my second question. And I think we've been through this. I remember a year ago, maybe, me claiming that there was counter evidence in what you yourself say. Nizam al-Mulk was the most powerful person for decades in the Seljuk Empire, and he was a Shafi'ite. And he was allowed to form this chain of madrasas, which were intended for Shafi scholars, not for Hanafi scholars, right? And they have this for Shiite now, but he was in the administration. And so those, I think, show that the picture is not,
Complicated.
exactly, that maybe they are the rhetoric is vehement, but on the ground, they divide their patrons not only of, or they don't, they do care for other madhabs, or not to estrange the other madhabs completely, as you have suggested. And very quickly, to answer Angela's question from my point of view, my research of a slightly later period, the post-Seljuk period in Syria, I've tried to figure out the components, the actual components of fidelity to madhab, because this, as my colleague Nimrod Povitz has pointed out, is really an amazing phenomenon. The fact that people are ready to kill each other and burn towns down because of what are actually minor legal differences, right? So why does the common person care about party? Why is it's so devoted to one madhab and not to another? So I tried to figure out what means fidelity to madhab in the post-Seljuk period in Syria, and there I won't present my paper, but I was looking at marriage patterns as far as one can tell by the sources, the division into quarters in the city, etc., and conversion. It's never dramatic.
Okay.
So no miracles. Yes.
Four points here that you raised. So I would take the fourth one first. I would like to take issue with this idea of minor points of law, because the essence of the madhab to that person is not the legal points of wherein they differ. That's like saying that the difference between, the Anabaptists and the Amish are so minor theologically, but it's not just these little minor points about when and what point you do the
I
baptism.
totally agree. And so
Okay, and
yes.
it's only we who see these as but it also encompasses an entire way of life and a social grouping and where you live and who's, how you pray, even if it's like for us, so you say the Bismillah before prayer or not, what could be more trivial than that? And why would they even object? The Hanbalites go and physically stop the prayer from happening because they regard this as so absolutely outrageous, because it's, are you faithful to Islam as the Prophet handed it down, or are you not? So that's the first point. Second point, which was about Nizam al-Mulk. Let's take Nizam al-Mulk. Nizam al-Mulk himself lived in terror, and he writes that I lived in constant fear of him because he disapproved of my madhab. But I think we find time and again that always a theory and ideal is one thing, but when someone's so brilliant and talented as Nizam al-Mulk comes along, it turns out they are willing to use him. I'll give you a parallel example. Nizam al-Mulk constantly says you should not hire dhimmis and use them. They should never be in a position over a Muslim. The only Jew I found that is hired and in a position of authority over Muslims in that period is Nizam al-Mulk. He hires this guy. And so on the one hand, you could try to argue, well, this is great. See, dhimmis had it good because he was hiring them. On both of those occasions, the person ended up being killed. In other words, the fact that he was able to come to prominence was an exception, and his position was always very tenuous. And at least in the case of dhimmis, it always led to a bad downfall. Not in Nizam al-Mulk, although Nizam al-Mulk was murdered in the end, right? And supposedly we don't know if it was really Ismailis. That's your third point. So I think Nizam al-Mulk's words are perhaps best, that obviously reality is always more complex than ideology, but that meant that there was a level of insecurity there. And that, yes, on the one hand, they could hire a Shafi, but on the other hand, he was afraid that they were going to trump up some charge that he's, as far as they were concerned, once you're religiously suspect, you could be an Ismaili. And in fact, he has to pay to suppress a rumor from an emissary from the Khan of Samarkand that he was a Batini, and he said, I knew that because he disapproved of my madhab, he would believe this. It would be credible. And we've seen numerous of these Shafi'i clerics being accused of Batinism because of their being Shafi'i and there being an intervention. So that's what I'd say about that. Your second question was, jihad. It's two sides of the same coin. That's not mutually exclusive. In other words, you have jihad towards the lands not yet under Allah's rule. And then you have commanding right and forbidding wrong and making sure it's real Islam and that they're obeying it within the lands that you're responsible over. So they're actually two sides of the same coin. That is the whole duty of the ruler. Now, jihad was dear to them from the beginning. That first letter that I cited, that all the sources have of the correspondence between them and the caliph, whether it happened in 1037 or it happened in 1043, I don't care. But the point is, all of them report the same kind of contents of the correspondence when it opened. And it's about, that's our justification. We are just good jihadists pursuing government the way it's supposed to be. Okay, first point about Turks versus others. That's an interesting question. Obviously, one of the drawbacks is there's no Turkish literature from this period. The earliest Turkish work is being written in this time, and it's the legendary Turkish. It's not a history. We don't have works being written that could tell us. All the historiography in Turkish about the Seljuks is much, much later. It's not this early stuff. So in other words, we have.
I meant something else, but I'm sorry. I meant part of the Turkish Arab competition. But
Here
let's
they
leave
seem
it
to
for.
see it as a kind of complementarity, that in other words, the Turkmens are meant to be rulers and commanders and warriors. And the Khorasanis are meant to be the administrators and the bureaucrats. And they need them because you have to have bureaucrats and administrators to pay salaries and collect the taxes and do all the stuff that bureaucrats do. So there was a complementarity there rather than a rivalry between them. And
Very briefly, because I know we're short on time. Everyone who's not working in Islamic studies in the room, Deborah's portrayal of Hanafism is not how Hanafis would want to portray it, okay? Hanafism portrays itself as the most tolerant, the most laid back, the most accepting of all of the madhahib within Islam. So this is an interesting example of how Hanafism becomes identified with Islam. To be Muslim is to be Hanafi. You see it repeated again in the South Asian context during the Mughal period sometime later, that somehow the religion which portrays itself as the most tolerant turns out to be the most doctrinaire. It's almost like we're so tolerant, you don't need to be different. So why are you different? So we're going to kill you for being different.
Yes.
So we're accept our tolerance. So Hanafism, that's an interesting thing about Hanafism, but also theologically that the texts, the historical texts seem to make no distinction between being Shiite and being Shafi, theologically speaking. Whereas theologically speaking, there's a big difference in terms of Hanafi theology, between being Shiite and being Shafi, in terms of religious creed, because there's an acceptance of being Shafi as being part of the community, and theologically speaking, the Shiites are not part of the community. But in the historical text, it shows, in a sense, the irrelevance of theological categories in some ways when you're writing history, because they make no distinction between being a Shiite or being a Shafi in terms of your opposition to the establishment of the true religion, which is quite an interesting way.
Is that true, or is it rhetorical? Because I think
I think
the cases where it says, this other method is just like the Jews or the Christians, they're so bad.
Yeah,
But it doesn't mean they actually are.
yeah. Well, I think the historical text.
Are the texts, though, the theological texts that are espousing this kind of more ecumenical view. How early?
The Hanafi texts,
Yes.
which
Yeah.
well, Hanafis would say they begin at the very beginning of the Hanafi madhab, because the Hanafi madhab is not based around the teachings of one teacher, but the teachings of three teachers who share. So they would say it's hardwired into the Hanafi perspective, is that an acceptance of diverse opinions.
Actual text.
But actual text, you're talking 200 years after Abu Hanifa. So you're talking a sort of like a sort of mid-10th century text for the Hanafi madhab. But the text, I mean, the question I suppose at the end is, do you get a sense in the text that there is a difference between being Shafi'i and being Shiite?
Not in the historical text.
And that's
But they're reporting on the way it's regarded. No.
yeah, because theologically there's a
Madhab.
distinction there. There's an important distinction there.
Well, if there's time, but is there time? Yeah, I was going to pick up on a couple of Daniela's, or rather Daniela picked up on a couple of things I was thinking. I'd like to push on a couple of them a bit more. One is the issue of identity then, and local, you mentioned this local identity, and it's not purely political. And so two things this strikes me. One is, what are the relationships between madhab and identity? Okay, so it's not specifically localized to one place. You said it's happening everywhere, but presumably, I mean, there's clear that you're talking about the Khorasanis in Iraq. So clearly there is a sense of some people who come from the outside and get jobs. And so there's a relationship between elite competition for resources and your madhab. And so that, to what extent is that structured in ethnically or, you know, regionally specific terms? Maybe this is what you're saying a bit about Turkic and Arabic, but so what, to what extent are there overlaps between your madhab and a specific identity?
Great question. Thank you for
And
raising
the
it.
other one is the difference between, and this is related to the difference between religious and political. So you're saying it's not just political, it's not just instrumentalized, but it's about belief and that sort of thing. I mean, do you think then we can divide the two? Would you say that there's the same, that basically religious symbolism is intrinsically involved in elite competition? Or is there a deen wa dunya element?
Okay.
Or,
Okay, so, yes, yes, I can. Regarding the first one, the interesting thing is that the sources in certainly Gundari and Imaduddin seem to equate Khorasaniness with Hanafism. And the fact is that all of the Seljuk administration, no matter where they're sending them to, are Khorasanis. They're all Iranians, Eastern Iranians, being sent to Baghdad, being sent to Syria in the early period, being sent to anywhere in the empire. They're using Khorasanis as their administrators. They're not using Arabs at all. So Arabs, you're only going to find in the Caliphate administration at this time. That's about ethnicity. Okay. Second is not in the high administration, I should say. Your second question is, let's look at the difference. I mean, the fact is that in a polity that regards politics as something secular, as areas of life outside the purview of religion, one can have a situation such as in England, where the prime minister is a Hindu, which would have been unthinkable in England in the 19th century. Okay, absolutely unthinkable, because the Church of England was part of the state of England, and that was there. In the era and the people that we're talking about, it would be absolutely unthinkable to make one's chief vizier a non-Muslim. It just couldn't happen. Okay, or even a Muslim, I can't think of, for example, the idea of a Seljuk making so the fact is there is a difference between Shafis and Sunni and Shiites, because that would have been a step too far. They never have a Shiite vizier, the Seljuks, and they did have Shafiite viziers on occasion in the beginning, not under Sanjar. It gets worse as time goes on. So it's a polity that has a sacred function and a sacred goal. It sees its legitimacy as deriving from the fact that they're establishing God's rule on earth and obeying God's laws, and therefore it would make no sense whatsoever not to be further than that. And there was no idea of a separation of church and state, or of areas being outside the purview of religion, or religion being confined to one building one day a week, the way that it is in secular or Western modern politics.
Good. Okay, so our second speaker is Marie-Céline Zaya from the Université Jean Moulin in Lyon. Her research focuses on the early Middle Ages, social and intellectual history, hagiography, the history of texts and ideas, amongst other topics. She has published numerous books and articles on medieval history and culture, among which I will mention l'histoire, l'islam, le passé, le vie, le passion matin, 4e, 11e siècle, qui came out of the histoire du texte. And in 2023, and another one in 2023, Liberté de parole, Zélix Savant, l'équipe de pouvoir au Orient de l'Occident, 2 PM, because that's the MCF, and we calculated it, we knocked out a bit, and came out this year with the title of our paper today, but it's not the online to begin to severity and level only on actual events in PBHL 8775, Latin geography and the restoration of the past 8 to 11 century.
Thank you, Ben.
And we should share screen.
Yeah.
And also, yes, Molly is circulating a handout, so please take forward if you have it.
I think there's not quite enough, so if anyone wants to give up some for the people. in the
We-
back.
More here.
Oh,
Oh, yeah, I just
Sorry. My bad.
understand that as something.
Share screen. Share screen.
Yeah.
Well, let's hope for the best.
Among all the texts of the early Middle Ages, hagiography is the one that speaks most about cleansing. Lavare, purgare, deterse, resordium, squalorem. It is not solely because this Christian literature speaks of purifying sins. The interest that hagiography holds in purification is inherent to its very purpose. Hagiography serves to cleanse its reader or listener. This idea is explicit in the prologue of the life of Saint Julian, written before 830. It is your first document. A spectacle such as the lives of the Holy Fathers is a kind of mirror that does not eliminate stains on garments or rectify disheveled hair, but rather avoids vices of the spirit, equips with virtues. Another cause is added to this initial generic one. Hagiography is characterized by the regular practice of rewriting. Hagiographers in the period between the 8th and the 11th centuries revisit what their predecessors wrote in order to clarify and correct it. And they speak of the necessary purification they must perform on the ancient texts for 3 major reasons. First, they correct the language. The writing removes and replaces grammatical or stylistic errors. Second, they eliminate logical contradictions and inconsistencies that undermine the credibility of the work, like anachronism. Third, writers remove clumsiness that incites laughter. The case of Saint Vivant de Vergy provides a good example. A hagiographer of the 9th century recounted that this priest lived during pagan antiquity under the persecution of Dacian, an emperor who does not exist. An angel asks Vivant to destroy the statue of Dacian and convert his daughter, and Vivant obeys. Blessed Vivant, he destroys the statue, then the next day, disguised to avoid recognition, he entered the bedroom where Cleopatra was. He scrutinized her attentively and said, "My daughter, my God, Jesus Christ." The monks of Vergy undoubtedly found the situation scandalous. It is not reasonable to narrate that a saint disguises himself to secretly enter the room of the bedroom of a young girl at night to reveal something to her. Therefore, the life was rewritten in a conventional form. And you've got the only manuscript that survives of the first version. Hagiography, therefore, has the habit of correction and censorship. But for our purposes here, these mechanisms of rewriting do not concern the past itself. An hagiographer who removes a date of an event deemed false is not purifying the past, is rectifying the text. adjusting his discourse to make it coherent with other information. To understand how hagiography contributes to purifying the past for people in the Middle Ages, we must not start with purification itself. We must ask when and why hagiographers are interested in the past. In his prologue to the life of Saint Albert, Azzo of Monterranda explains that in order to be useful to the monastery of Luxeuil, he will renew the memory of the past, refresh it, or present it again. This is true. The text is not solely dedicated to the life of Saint Albert, it encompasses the whole history of Luxeuil from its foundation in the late 6th century to the present time, spanning 4 centuries. Azzo thus uses hagiography to bring back a bygone past that might be lost due to its remoteness or distance. You have the text of Azzo on document 2. Azzo is representative of a true innovation. Between the 8th and the 11th centuries in the West, hagiographers write the history of a distant past that is inaccessible through memory. It is an anomaly. Since hagiography has existed, the Vita of a Saint is written shortly after his death by a witness who knew him well. Athanasius of Alexandria knew the great Anthony. Sulpicius Severus knew Martin of Tours. Temporal proximity is the norm. However, this close relationship is disrupted between the 8th and 11th centuries. Authors then begin to write the lives of saints who lived during times of persecution in the late antiquity or under the rule of barbarian kingdoms. If we count the lives written in Western Francia during the 10th century, we can identify 113 lives. This is on your left, of which 9 place their saint after 750, representing 7% of the sample, when 48 place their saint between 500 and 750, accounting for 42%, you can read. The writing of recent past has become very minority. As Azzo explained, authors use hagiography to revive a past that no one truly remembers. The same measurement can be made based on 110 lives written during the mid-9th century. This is on your right. It is not the entirety of the lives written during this century, only those that are best known. We only find 20% of recent saints. For 8 out of 10 saints, the authors act as historians in the sense that they cannot rely on their own memories or the testimonies of previous generations. They must rediscover the past through other means and justify their audacity by always invoking the same reasons. First, the incompetence of previous century, of course. Second, the disappearance of books due to invasions. And third, and more important for us, their knowledge of history thanks to historians. In the 9th century, hagiographers began to extensively use historical sources. Some of them show a considerable amount of knowledge. For example, one of the patients of the martyr Lucien of Beauvais, written in the 9th century about a saint from the 1st century, contains a scholarly description of the city of Beauvais during the ancient period. You'll find the manuscript on the slide, but The text is number 3. We read that there was a Roman garrison and a military troop stationed there, and the people of Beauvais had always been inclined towards war. From this city alone, as found in official histories, more than 40,000 men from the same region, together with the rest of the citizens of Gaul, marched into battle against Julius Caesar and the Roman army. What is the purpose of this erudition? It serves to depict a past marked by strong antagonisms. Lucian's actions will be heroic in this warlike context. This is the predominant feature of all these texts that recreate an ancient past. Through diligent research, sometimes involving genuine historical reconstruction, and at times fueled by imagination, this text presents a past where the Seine confronts an identified enemy, paganism or heresy, and emerges victorious. The mechanism is easy to grasp in the case of Saint-Chéry, thanks to Charles Mériot's study of successive rewriting. In the first Merovingian life on your left, the saint is buried in the basilica, which he had commanded to be built during his lifetime, the place where he took care to make the idols disappear. In the 10th century rewriting, Chéry was buried in the basilica that was built on the hillside. In ancient times, the place had been dedicated by pagans to demonic rites. They corrupted souls there. That is why the man of the law, joyfully mentioned Jerry, expelled the idols, cut down the sacred wood, and transformed a place dedicated to filth into a house of prayer and sacrifice. The hagiographer has amplified the horror of the pagan past. The saint not only made idols disappear, but literally purified the demonic sanctuary. The 11th century rewriting finally adds the historical realism produced by erudition and the observation of archaeological remains. This is your document 4. A classical and rhetorically effective dichotomy is employed. Paganism is linked to impurity, while Christianity brings purification. And to achieve this result, the hagiographer did not censor the past, but instead amplified and darkened it by resorting to stereotypes. There are numerous examples of such treatment of antiquity, with an increasing number of pagan temples that the saint must destroy. For example, you've got document 5, the life of Saints Erland and Relande, written in the late 9th century, that asserts that the two saints destroyed pagan temples, and one wonders where they found them in Merovingian Gaul, where they lived. Examples of this reconstructed past are common. They demonstrate that hagiography does not seek to purify the past by eliminating pagans, tyrants, or barbarians, but rather by inventing and even magnifying them. The wicked characters indeed serve an essential cathartic function. Adversaries are needed for the sense to triumph and ensure that the past had been purified of its main vices. The Carolingian era thus constructs a history of the church with clear stages corresponding to the impurities from which the church has been cleansed by the saints. The first obvious impurity is that of paganism. However, heresy occupies an increasingly significant place during the 9th century. Let's take the first life of Saint Bibianus, written during the 6th century. It recounts the exile of Bishop Vivianus, a victim of Theodoric, king of the Goth. There is no mention of a religious difference. The Goths under Theodoric deports the inhabitants of Sens and steal their possessions. It is a story of conquest, not a religious war. The same situation is taken up by the author of a revoking of the life of the Bishop of Die, Saint-Marcel, in the first quarter of the 9th century. It recounts that the king of the Visigoths, Uric, deports the population of Die. However, the Carolingian writer gives a confessional interpretation of the situation. At that time, King Uric was at the head of the Gothic nation, more driven by Arian cruelty, and under the pressure of Arian cruelty, the Saint ended up in prison in Ars. The hagiographer invents that Uric's policy is motivated by Arian cruelty, because in his time, the prevailing representation of the late antique past is one of a struggle between orthodoxy and heresy. This representation can be inspired by the reading of historical sources. It also depends on the mission of defending orthodoxy that Charlemagne and then Louis Pius believed that they had undertaken. Arianism is thus resurrected in the hagiographical texts of the 9th century in order to be better eradicated. I skipped the example of St. Lorian. You can read the text number 6 by yourself. It's exactly the same story. The hagiographers of the 9th century have learned to identify in the history of the church this crucial stage of the 4th to 6th centuries, which is no longer marked by the struggle against persecutors, but by the internal threat of division and error. Tirelessly, they narrate this context, always using the same terms to prove that the church has overcome this danger, that the bishops have purified the people from its defilements. In the life of Saint Severinus, Bishop of Cologne in the 4th century, the hagiographer, writing in the late 9th century, preaches extensively to explain the significance of the battles fought in this distant past. This is your document 7. The Arian contradiction was at its peak during that time. It had insidiously infiltrated the very core of almost the entire church, etc. The past is not forgotten or neutralized. On the contrary, persecutions and the Arian heresy become part of a now conventional narrative of church history. From the document 8 from the late 11th century, our faith and religion were flourishing, with the exception that the filthy Arian murmuring, which still crawled hidden in a few corners, had recruited Patriarch Paul of Constantinople and Bishop Cyril of Alexandria. This passage, taken from the 11th century life of Saint Jean, has no parallel in the life from the 8th century. The hagiographer of the late 11th century adds it because it proves that the church has been guided through the upheavals of the past by a succession of crises and resolutions. That is the true subject of purification. Ultimately, it is not from paganism or heresy that the hagiographers purify the past. Their main aim is to purify it from absurdity. Does the past seem incoherent? This does not prove the absence of divine governance. One of the earliest examples appears in the life of Saint Vaast of Arras. The life was written twice, once by Jonas of Bourbourg and once by Alcuin. Jonas and Alcuin describe Vaast's survival in a ruined city. Arras had been Christianized, but it was destroyed by Attila. It is an observation for Jonas on the left. People no longer resided in the city as the king of the Huns, Attila, had destroyed it and left it languishing in its filth. Alcuin replaces this contextual and causal observation within a development on the providential order of things. It is not by chance that Attila invaded Gaul. You have but an extract on the slide, but the whole text appears as document 9. This was not the result of the pagans' valor, but of the sins of the Christian people. Alcuin is explaining that invasions are not signs of the disorder of the past, as if God has ceased to govern the world. Rather, they serve as the purification of the church through punishment. What is the purpose of evil? Hagiographers of the 7th or 8th century observed its existence without explaining it. Starting from the 9th century, and especially in the 10th and 11th centuries, many hagiographers revisited situations that were incomprehensible from a human perspective. They dismissed the hypothesis of chance and reaffirmed that history has meaning. In particular, they contemplate enigmas in the history of church. First, the reign of Julian the Apostate, how to explain the transformation of a Christian prince into a persecutor and a pagan. Second, the barbarian invasion. Why did God allow the fall of a universal Christian empire into the hands of pagans? The case of Saint Sever, with which I conclude, has the advantage of addressing both of these enigmas simultaneously. Sever is a pagan king from the east who converts to Christianity under the influence of the Holy Spirit. He desires to die as a martyr during the persecution of Julian the Apostate, but his admirers among his contemporaries refuse to betray him. After considering becoming an hermit, he chooses exile in the hope of becoming a martyr. The Pope sent him to evangelize the Basques, and after expelling the demons that afflict their King Adrian, he baptizes the king and his people before the arrival of the Vandals and his own execution. The first hagiographer of Saint Sever explains that all these events prove that the devil acts in history. The devil reacts to the extraordinary growth of the church during the early centuries of persecution by creating Julian the Apostate. And the same hagiographer explains that the sins of man justifies invasions. In this case, invasions of the Vandals. You have the whole text as document 11 and an extract only on the slide. Our sins have greatly multiplied before God, and due to our transgressions, our defenses have been reduced to little. Because of the evil we commit and the negligence of the people, the kingdom is not delivered into the hands of foreigners. This is an initial effort to purify the past from arbitrariness and bring some logic to the most absurd events of the 4th century. Unfortunately, this initial effort has the drawback of being logical, yet somewhat despairing. If it is the devil who rules the world, and if the sins of men justify evil, what can people hope for in this world? This explanation given by the first hagiographer must have seemed imperfect or incomplete to another hagiographers who revisits the same story to better explain God's action. The second hagiographer, speaking through Saint-Sever, explains that believers always run the risk of misinterpreting evil. Saint-Sever began to fear that some occasion for scandal might arise among these people whose faith was progressant, that they might believe they were rewarded for their recent audacity, that is, their conversion to Christianism, rather than for their past sins. And the whole text is about proving that the whole history has a meaning. You've got extracts as documents 12, 13, 14, I skip. Conclusion. Latin hagiography is a primary source from the early Middle Ages that speaks most about purification. But one must not be deceived. It does not purify the past by rendering it perpetually edifying or admirable. It does not purify through forgetting, censorship, correction, or moral reformulation. Instead, hagiographers employ the mechanism of catharsis. They resurrect persecutions, Arianism, and barbarian invasions. They portray them in the darkest and most conventional light. Idolatry of the pagans, decidedly heretics, and leashed violence of the barbarians. The horrors unfold, shaping a history of the church as a succession of dreadful crises. Is this cathartic structure really something new? Since the early days of hagiography, the patients explained that the most visible crisis is also the one that allows for the most resplendent triumph. The martyr dies, but faith prevails. The cathartic discourse is already embedded in this narrative, which meticulously describes the tortures, only to ultimately proclaim at the end that the martyrs emerge victorious. The novelty brought to this mechanism in the 8th to 11th centuries lies in taking the past as its subject. It is in truth history that becomes the object of reflection for hagiographers and the target of the cathartic mechanism. The majority of hagiographers choose not to bear witness to what occurred in their own time, but rather to recount the distant past. Through this choice, they manage to purify the past. What is being purified, not evil, but rather the greatest danger to the Christian faith, which is doubt. Does God govern the course of world history? This concern is evidently paramount for the Christian societies of that era, and hagiography, this is my belief, serves to digest the past in order to purify it from doubt. I thank you for your patience.
Thank you very much. It was very, very interesting, and I like very much the idea of screening the past from hagiographical past from absurdity. I mean, that's that Bollandist spirit, I would say. But now I'm thinking about, not getting rid of the pagan and or heretical past, rather emphasizing it, because we in a way a hagiographer needs the bloody pagans and heretics. So I wonder whether it tells us something more about the perception of the past, at least among the intellectuals of this era, or is it just something which results from the nature of hagiography itself, or from the nature of clerical hagiography? Let's face it, the lives of the bishops are quite boring. Sorry for that. You don't have dramatism inside. I mean, if there is a bishop who just runs his church and nothing happens, almsgiving, fine. But what else do you have? Well, standing firm in front of a king or a magistrate. But if you need dramatism, so if you are if you are writing about a bishop from the pre-Constantinian period, so it's very tempting to make him a martyr. So what you have, and if you are writing about a bishop after the Constantinian breakthrough, try to make him fight the heretics. Do you think, my impression was that you were leaning toward the latter solution, but I wonder whether what would you say? So it's a broader attitude toward the past, or it's just requirements of the specific genre?
If it was a requirement from the public, to have heroism, something that happens, at least in this text, I believe that we would not have these stories in feminine hagiography, because you do not only have bishops' lives, but also Erland and Roland. It's for a very monastic audience, a female monastic audience, and there are many pagan temples, and they destroy them. And so I do not consider that the expectations of the audience are the main reason for hagiographers to go back to the past. The second observation is that it's only during 9th, 10th, and 11th century that we have this focus on the past. And you can, I spent 60 years counting all the texts to achieve this, you've seen there's histograms, and it's really an anomaly. So I believe more in the spirit of the era. I believe that Carolingian rule implies to control the past. I believe that the Carolingian rule relies on telling the true past, having good emperors, rewriting the Constantinian era in a certain light, and all the elites are pondering upon the past as a tool of government. So hagiographers are in this move. So the genre has its own ways and can reconstruct the past in a way that no other genre can achieve, but hagiography is not isolated in this way of manipulating or digesting the best.
I can see some of the features that you mentioned in much earlier hagiography, but probably not up to this not up to this point, and we can discuss it.
Not this, not this chronological distance, you know. Never in medieval hagiography, we have these authors from the 9th century writing the story of the bishop of the 1st century and creating the whole.
Yes,
Yeah.
go ahead. Yes.
So I just want to respond to what you said about boring Carolingians. Since you have Godelieve, who's murdered by her in-laws, and Gangulf, who is a saint because he refrains from murdering his adulterous wife. These were exciting people. Okay.
No, it was about clerical hagiography as a genre,
Okay.
default clerical life.
All right. I just wanted to, I found your paper really beautiful and fascinating. Thank you so much. And I'm just wondering, is there also perhaps an element of historical setting and context of this, that in other words, when we get to the Carolingian era, so first you have Charlemagne actually battling against pagans, you know, Avars and Magyars, etc. And then, of course, that whole disruption of the late Carolingian and post-Carolingian period, when you have active invasions, you know, Arabs and Vikings and Magyars, and could it be sort of a way of trying to keep up people's spirits that, no, we've been through things like this in the past, we can survive it again, as sort of a response to current events?
I definitely link the effort to give history a meaning to the invasions.
Yes.
Yes, it happens since 860. First manifestation of this various periods. So you probably have the feeling that what happens has no meaning at all, and God is
Abandoned us.
Yes.
They need to know they're gonna have victory in the end.
Yeah, but it's this obvious link between what happens in the world and the effort to give an answer to audiences and laymen. This obvious solution is not enough. I mean, there is also a very intellectual dimension of the phenomenon, meaning that during Charlemagne's day, nobody talks about heresy or paganism when Charlemagne is really combating, struggling with Saxons, for example. But at this time, you've got an hagiographer like Lupus of Ferrières, who suddenly reads Bede and put some passages of the Historia Ecclesiastica within his life of Wigbert. This is an intellectual reflex, going back to historical texts, and it's a very novelty of the 9th century. Then when these intellectuals have this habit of consulting historical sources, it inspires them of their, intellectual trends, like giving the meaning of events and not narrating them. So firstly, I always start by the contextual explanation, but there is also an intellectual history within the hagiographical genre.
Thank you.
Marie-Céline, merci beaucoup pour une analyse dominante. It links up with my question, and comment links up with the previous two, particularly these. That I think this might be a very good example of what Foucault calls a histoire du présent, a history, writing a history of the present. Essentially, that this sort of restructuring of history via geography is more about their time than the past. And it perhaps, I mean, they obviously have interests in the past, but this is sort of where, and this is where my question was, an initial paper that I wanted to do for this conference was actually very similar to this. I wanted to look at the same type of language of purity and pollution in hagiography, but during the Chalcedonian period with the Syriac literature, where we have very similar type of situations with people like John of Ephesus. Also a lot of purity and pollution language there, of course, heresy. So what my question is, I was fascinated by the use of paganism in these texts, and you've said a great deal about that. So does paganism stand for if we consider this as a history of the present, what does paganism stand for? Does it stand for heresy? It stands for paganism as a threat from outside the borders, or maybe the Carolingians, I don't know. Maybe I'd be curious to, it seems you have an answer.
You're perfectly right speaking about the history of the present, but it is not a history of the political present.
Yeah.
It's a history of the actual training of the hagiographers.
Absolutely.
And we can write, I'm writing right now, an educational history of the early Middle Ages through hagiography, because these texts reflect what they learn at school. And this is the answer for paganism. They learn Roman paganism, a purely theoretical one, with Venus statues, with Jupiter statues, and temples. And you've seen the sacred wood. Where does the sacred wood come from? It was not in the first text, because the first text was about paganism in Gaul, meaning sacred fountains, sacred trees, nothing to do with animal sacrifices and temples and sacred wood. And these are purely
Invention.
but invention from erudition, invention from knowledge. These authors came to school, learned a lot, read Rosius, and believe that paganism is a Roman paganism.
Thank you very much. That's
Eric, but I think that
basically answered what you just touched on, and I was thinking about, is it also like a layer of intertextuality produced by, all these, the production of text during the period in their reading, because all your examples, I can come up with an early or late antique example of all these things, and so yes, absolutely. So
Yes.
I think you can stop it.
so you still have Rob and Wolfgang. Please.
I have a brief question. Thank you for the wonderful paper. I was reminded, I think Paul Foraker once said Carolingians liked dead saints and they did not like living saints. I think there's something to it there as well.
Yes.
I was wondering, because the dating of the text sometimes eluded me a little bit. Whether this focus on paganism, was that earlier than the focus on heresy? Or does that happen at the same time? But my question is there a kind of chronological development there?
I cannot answer. I have no statistics on these appearance. I know, for instance, that if you look at Norman hagiography during the 10th to 11th century, artists always write about the 7th century. So in some areas, we can link focus on the century to a regional concern. But as a whole, with all Carolingian hagiography, I cannot answer right now.
Yeah.
But I can come back to my numbers.
Thank you.
Yeah, I can also be very brief. What you said reminds me of the transfer of relics in the Carolingian period. Drucklein wrote about this. It's striking that there is actually few or no Saxon saints, so recent saints produced during the Carolingian wars against the Saxons. They rather use Roman relics from the past, so they have no recent saints, but saints from the canonical past. So this would be an interesting parallel to what you have said. And the question would be, did you focus exclusively on Gaul or France or Eastern Germany, or did you also look on Anglo-Saxon England, including on Italy, Visigoth Spain, or Spain at all? Is this valid also for this other region outside the core of Carolingian Europe?
It's really easy to answer because there is no Anglo-Saxon geography since lead to the renewal after Alfred. So you have no text. It's a really striking feature of Anglo-Saxon times that progressively they import texts as a link to Rome, not using relics but using texts. And hagiography is produced in the Carolingian Empire. So I take the whole text from Italy, from Germania, and from if we have to in Germania, there are much more texts about the present sense because of Anglo-Saxon missionaries and the I believe the actual presence of sense, because it's also a reality. In Gaul, there are no more martyrs, and if you need one, you've got to look back to the late antiquity. But in Germany, if you want a martyr, you have Saint Boniface. So you can write and rewrite again his data, and it's not from a distant past. You've got one at hand. So yes, there is room for regional analysis, but I take the whole literature.
Okay, so sorry, we're out of time. Let's thank our speakers again. Further that to reconvene within 13 minutes.
There's not much determination in what you said.
I know that
Oh, yeah.
Right. Second, but on hagiography, yeah, you know, I have some questions, but I have I'll come back. We still have time to talk. Yes, I have, and I have questions about the downloads.
I actually trying to talk about
Sorry, one more time.
Right? Oh, yes, and you sent me that. Yeah, I have it. So I will. The last order, but yes. I love to. But I'm not at all.
So
It's more of a celebration of it.
you like might have attended to speak about Saints like and then sometimes later we can do it again, embellish with a purifying aspect, describing what the saint did in a future
Presentation? Yes, I have. I have uploaded.
Robert, you're speaking on,
Right, okay.
Robert,
And that-
you're speaking on what period?
Sorry?
Are you speaking on which period? I saw the title.
To be
Is it the case that the first?
from the 4th until the 6th
So
century.
I'm right in saying I'm the modernist here. Yeah. Okay.
More what you might think of.
Sorry.
No, that's okay. It allows me a joke in the beginning. It's fun.
Yeah.
And can I just run your name by you, just to make sure that I've.
Yeah,
so
sure.
it's Nama.
I know.
Yeah.
Owen.
It's just
Yeah.
I'm trying to think,
Yeah.
how else do we do it?
I can look. And I think I know this
Yeah.
next piece. Because
So it's almost like, it's more like
Oh,
Help me, help me.
In the Islamic.
Angela, you got with
About.
the name like that. How you
Yeah.
miss? Oh, that's a-
We think more like a.
I just need to be taught.
Yeah. You know, because it's not,
Okay.
you know, there's two similar stuff.
Yes.
One is like in an English, so we write it by SZ and it's equal to SI.
You know.
And the other one is softer. I cannot explain it how it
But
goes.
okay, but let me hear it one more time. I mean, the whole thing.
So the one that you're accustomed to is sh, and the one that you need to use it is sh. Yeah, like Vishня.
Vishня. So a little dry sound.
Yeah.
So I did
The
actually
other question I had was.
where in the written part when I was a child in the Polish language, but
Yeah, I know, you were at Sunday school, I remember.
so, I don't know, I'll do my best.
Yeah. That's right. Although.
Cherry, yes, cherry, cherry skin, yeah.
The fragility towards Christianity. The population who fought out with belief very easily. And the saints are needed to, you know, because if they were good at getting rid of paganism, why does it keep reoccurring in another saint's life and another saint's life? Yeah.
Yes.
So I think this is,
Well, it's always going to win.
yeah.
It always wins.
But you can never. So I will just mention Julian, and
there's
then Chris, for you, there will be John Chrysostom mentioned, especially for you.
I will tell you what I think. I think that this can control
They would have to.
No, more general, but it's.
things,
But
but I don't want to
be
leave it in case.
failed research.
I will ask.
Of research which tried to find pollution and didn't. Oh, yes, yes. And it was just obviously there is, because I usually take that at the beginning. What if we focus on you know, the mostly pagans, but also some Christians finding the relics or the bodies of the dead polluted, even if they were martyrs. So that we can find in the late fourth and the beginning of the 7th century. But finally, I realized that they don't struggle against paganism all the time. So you know, like when I was writing about the some strengths, I probably I began all the time, and the next century again, the next century again, and then there's maybe. We can ask about it in the discussion. I was thinking about it, but I decided to leave it aside.
The story that you're talking about are concrete.
Can I upload something?
Like that's the policy.
Okay, yes, now.
So after now, finishes.
Okay, so
Have to portray it as.
I also realized I did bring a flash drive, but I didn't bring the connector thing. So I can't really use it.
It's a USB-C?
Yeah, the USB, it won't go into my laptop. I mean, I do have my PowerPoint. Can you load?
You want to maybe do like this, load it to yours?
I mean, I can do it directly from my.
Is
maybe better to do this.
Okay.
No, but I think hers is the opposite. She needs.
No, that is correct. Thank you.
All right.
So is that, and then I guess,
And then you can put it on the date.
yeah. Then I can, thank you.
This may be a way in which we.
Dirty Bones.
By the theologians as a example of and being Shafi, which is like a Muslim heresy, well, a Sunni Muslim heresy from the Hanafi perspective. And being an error. And it's like they're both you need to go cleansed, they're both, but the cleansing process is not quite the same.
So when I.
Right.
So,
Examples of positives, negatives. Without converting to Christianity. So they are already showing good qualities. Yeah, I see. Yes, they become Christian. It's not like they. It's sort of like a noble established. Yeah. What was his name again? Yeah,
Discipline the speakers. People discipline the speakers, crack the whip.
I mean, I don't know. It's a lot.
I mean, no, but yeah.
I'm ready to. I won't let the horses ride off into the night. Can I ask everybody to come back to the table? We have a belt. How is it that you can say that so softly and get
Everybody, please.
It's in my mind, mostly in my mind, and even somehow there.
It's a little bit.
It's a very good Christmas. Yeah, I'm not going to steal yours. Don't worry. It's one of those. That continues. I might go and get another one.
Yeah. No, they're.
It's my delight now to open the second session of the conference by introducing Nama Cohen Haneki. She is the senior lecturer of medieval history at Tel Aviv University and the author of the book Caring for the Living Soul: Emotions, Medicine, and Penance in the Late Medieval Mediterranean. She is currently working on another monograph with the provisional title Postpartum and Mental Distress in Late Medieval Europe. And we should all congratulate her because she recently received news that she has an ERC grant for a new project, which will be on the medieval placebo effect, hope and belief in healthcare in Christian Southern Europe in 1100 to 1500. And this will start in September 2024. And it's my delight now to open her paper, which is called Postpartum Purification Practices in Iberia from the 13th to the 15th centuries. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you, Yaniv, also for inviting me, although I'm a modernist among medievalists here, and my work today will go, I will even mention the 16th century. So, and also, I think in some ways, my regard for purification is a bit more bloody than most of the papers in this conference. So excuse me for the gore that will be involved here. But I just realized as we were sitting and hearing the two great lectures before, that I didn't realize how much my work is on history in this particular paper as well. So I'll be very happy to think about histories and chronicles as we discuss the paper later on. And I have the pleasure of presenting this a different form of this paper in May. So I'm sorry for all the people who already heard this. I hope it's a little bit more concise or with a point this time. And I should say that this is part, Angela mentioned, it's part of a talk, it's part of a project that deals with postpartum mental distress, and so working out the relationship between them. And the purification aspect is part of how I'm thinking about this time after birth. So it's in a way, it's also a little bit on the side of my own project, but it allows me to think about what it means in various ways. So this I will share it with you, and I think in a way it's an ongoing progress, but so I would love your comments and ideas. In the middle of the 13th century, Alfonso el Sabio assembled or composed the Cantiga de Santa Maria, a collection of 420 songs and hymns to the Virgin Mary that include tales of Mary and miracles. The 89th Cantiga tells the tale of the Jewess that was helped in childbirth. This was a popular tale throughout Europe, which narrated in at least 13 variants between the 12th and 15th centuries. The story tells of a Jewish woman who was suffering terribly in childbirth. Although she lacked faith, Mary, full of compassion, showed herself to her through light and sound. Her heart immediately changed, and she gave birth without pain and further delay. She was then rebuked by the Jewish women who assisted her labor, but she went to church and was baptized dopo los 30 días, after 30 days, following 30 days. That is, after her purification days were over. And I just realized, was I supposed to share this with it? No, okay. The screen, no? Okay.
Oh, it's sharing the screen, it would be preferable.
Okay, so I kind of lost the Zoom. Okay. So I found this minor addition curious because it offers a break in the narrative and introduces a halt where the dramatic need of the account would be to send the newly converted woman into the church immediately straight. But my intuition was also reinforced by the existing versions of the miracle, which treat the moment in a different way. So I will not go into complete comparisons of the versions here, and only mention that while some drop the time of waiting altogether, she gives birth and runs to the church. Other versions emphasize this new convert was only baptized at church following purification, such as the version told by Vincent de Beauvais in 1217, a version in which the Jewess, after seeing the light and converting, runs away from the abusive Jewish woman, and then he writes, "Post dies purificationi suae, assumpti spiri suis ad ecclesiam." After her days of purification, she with her children went to church.
So the Cantiga identifies this days of purification with a specific number, 30 days. Okay. That's another kind of intervention, noting what is the time of purification, which we'll return to later on. Another literary indication of this postpartum custom appears in the satirical misogynist poem by the Valencian 15th century physician Jean Roy, who lashes at women who run around after giving birth, getting pregnant, destroying their milk, and thereby harming their children. Once they have given birth, they rest very little. 1 month after they get up, that they already go to the bath and set up their traps to catch gray mullets. There's a pun here. They go out to mass with their sons or daughters, and like rabbits, with their bellies already big, they don't have enough milk in their bodies, and put both children in great danger of death. Both these little vignettes, there are many things that we can pick on: the connection between blood and milk, and the connection between Mary and Judaism, and the purification, but I will leave them for now, and if you will want to, we'll have time, we can go and develop them further. But both these tell us that women in Iberia were expected and did perform some kind of purification ritual after giving birth, which included a period of a month or so at home and an act of entering the church. However, while the preservation of purification practices in late medieval Iberia is widespread assumption, everyone thinks that women had a purification practice in the Middle Ages. It is undocumented, hardly documented. I will bring a few, but it's very little documented and unstudied practice. In contrast to Northern France, which is anyhow better documented, and we're already from the late 13th century, there are ecclesiastical concerns with the regulation of postpartum practices. In Iberia, none are documented until the 16th century. So the first that we have, I'm sorry if it's a little bit small, the script, is from a synod from Guadix in the middle of the 16th century that states very clearly that women must go to church in their parish within a month or a month and a half if they're not feeling well to give to take mass. The synod is emblematic of a growing attempt to surveil private religious practices in Iberia. In another decree from that same synod, it is prohibited to light furnaces of bathhouses on Sunday and holidays on the final days of the Holy Week, which according to Olivia Remy-Constable was part of a broader legislation to curtail ablution practices of newly converted Muslims. So this kind of synod that we have already in France earlier aims to bring the parishioners to their own church, and the emphasis here is not to go to the monasteries or to go to the fraternities to take the mass, it is to go to the church, okay? And we should always obviously read these synodal decrees against the grain. What does that mean? Did women not go to church at all? Did they not go to their parish priest, or did they prefer did they prefer to stay home? And how, and also this emphasis on time should also raise the question, who said on what occasion, when should women go to the church? So it is this question that I started looking more closely at purification practices, being particularly perplexed with the ways in which purification practices were maintained despite the absence or the obliteration of a concept of impurity or pollution. And I will take you today through my journey making sense of this phenomenon, with some aspects of it largely indebted to other scholars who studied this before me, which has helped me to think about how we should approach these sources. And I will briefly discuss the origin of this practice among Christians throughout the Middle Ages. And here we have to think, and this is a continual question for me, how do we think about chronology when we think about the origins of such ideas that are conceptualized, but also put to practice? And I should also point out that I think this aspect of conceptualizing purification, which has drawn much attention and thought about how do we understand the relationship between impurity and purity, and the fact that there is no impurity of blood, but there is a concept of impurity. Nevertheless, I will just explain this a little bit further later on, but the focus has been naturally on the writing of males writing for theological reasons, and we have very, very little information about how this is observed and what it means for women actually practicing this. So this is the first thing I want to look at will be the origin, and then I will try to think through geographical, chronological, and social aspects. And this will be a very short part of the presentation on the spread of purification practices in late medieval Iberia in context. And I will then turn to what interests me most, and that is meaning. And I've noted here a few things I want to state here, and then I'll return to them again. So one that I already noted is there an ongoing concept of blood purity, even though blood purity does not exist? Scholars looking at rituals of purification in England and in France have brought in the anthropology of rituals and thought about these rituals as rites of passage, as rituals of reintegration. Of course, this has much these ideas have much going for them, but I will also try and think about this from my own sources, which we will reach eventually, that are from chronicles that tell us of moments of crisis, and to look through this crisis and what does it say about the meaning that is attributed to this type of purification. And I will suggest that purification is a recuperative time, and in a way, thinking about this as a recuperative time underrides or undoes what the meaning of purification means when we think of it through more conventional sources. Okay, so that's the plan for now. I will be very brief. So this is Leviticus 12, and I will just run through it. I hope everyone knows this, right? The idea that women after childbirth should be abstain from going to the temple, and they are impure, and there is a difference between impurity after a child, a male child, and impurity after a female child. And this impurity law relate to the temple only, and even in Jewish law ongoing, the idea of what that impurity means is very difficult to understand and has different meanings over time. How much is the woman impure when she's impure? Because the impurity is ritual and not internal. Okay, so that is one, and that is a text that stands like a rock within the sources, and is better explained through this discussion that Gregory the Great has with Augustine. And of course, this is a 6th century text where Augustine is writing Gregory. What do we do? Augustine is converting this, right? You all know this much better than I do, but he's asking, what do we do with women after childbirth? And Gregory's response is, there is no actual impurity. It's all symbolic. It's all an idea. If a woman wants to go into church, she can. And this idea, this response of Gregory is repeated again and again into the 13th century, when I'm more comfortable with that. There's a sense that people ask, is there an impurity? People also respond that there is a sense of impurity, and this is on some in the 12th century. already thinking about the burial status of a woman who is impure. So there is a sense that is still ongoing and still people are responding, scholars are responding to it. Sorry, scholars, theologians of the time respond to it, that there is an impurity in childbirth that should bar a woman from going into church dead or alive. But at the same time, there is Gregory's words are repeated through the ages in the confession manuals and in discussions of the state of women's purity, and also in another kind of text that I didn't bring here, which is interesting to reflect on, the discussions of Mary's impurity after childbirth, and why does Mary go why does she purify herself even though she's not impure? So this ongoing discussion among male theologians thinking about what is the woman's state reveals that there is an ongoing noise regarding the state of purity of women after childbirth. They're not really impure, not blood impure, but they're still impure in some sense. And they're still not allowed to be buried in church in some places, or it's frowned upon in some sense, right? So there's this, we can trace this kind of origins that goes back to the Jewish sources and to early Middle Ages, which ferments in late medieval sources of writing theologians. It is not a very common topic of discussion, though. I think from 13th century, it's less evident in the legal sources and more evident in the discussions of Mary's purity and the sermons given at Candlemas festivities. Okay. Another sort of origin that is for me very interesting because of the way it conflates with the sources, never intentionally, but I think always in the background of people thinking about what is purification, is the actual biological process of women's childbirth and how long are women still bleeding after childbirth. And this is a text from the 15th century here, translated from the Spanish, translated from the Latin, apparently, but also refers to Hippocrates, and Aristotle has something similar. So this is a whole Greco-Arabic tradition that comes into Latin from various ways that regards how the length of time that a woman bleeds after childbirth. And here also we see, very interestingly, the difference between bleeding after a male child and a girl child and a female child. Okay, can take a moment to read it. I think it is also interesting how it compares the inception and conception and the childbirth and the postpartum bleeding. One thing I mentioned and I want to clarify is, why do I think these kind of texts somehow, or these kind of ideas link in some way? So first they link in terms of this is what happens after childbirth, right? This is a kind of a positional coincidence, but also they connect in another way. The word that is used for this kind of purgation is purificatio in most of the texts. And in some of the texts that discuss postpartum mental distress, postpartum cases, and I go over already to my other thing, but even just postpartum, it is very confusing sometimes to see whether they're speaking about an actual purgation that occurs naturally to the body, a purgation that is that is done manually in some ways, that is procured, or the time of purification that is more conceptual or considered within a religious notion. And the word for all of them also could be, sometimes they regard custom. they all become custom. So in a way, they also conflate in that way. Okay. I turn to the spread of this practices of purification. As I said, Iberia is very silent, but Italy, France, England are very, very talkative about purification in different ways. From Spain, from Italy, we have enormous material culture that is extant. These are plates that are given to women in the childbirth, in the postpartum room. They would be hanged there, they would be looked at, and they celebrate this moment of postnatal state. We have various kinds of texts from France, as I mentioned, but also women writing in the 14th century about these practices. And in England, we have various court records that relate to how people remember the time of the childbirth. So it's a different kind of text. So we do know that these practices were very, very widespread, but it's still very difficult outside of Iberia, and especially in Iberia, to think about who are the women doing this. Are all women undergoing this kind of postpartum period? And one of the things I've been doing for a while, and has led me nowhere, but it's still interesting, is to look at what happens to the women who are nurses. So women who are prepared as feeders recently gave birth, and what happens to them in terms of the period that should be held after childbirth. You understand what I mean? Mm-hmm. Right. So these are cases of women. These are contracts, and we have here different kinds of women. Most of them are slaves, and they're also newly convert slaves. So it's definite that they're at the bottom of the social strata, but they are taken into the homes when their newborn is a day old, 11 days old, 25 days old. And this is very interesting in terms of what do you expect that these women had a time to rest or at a time to stay at home in some ways. They're already going into work, but also it is interesting in terms of the blood, because medically speaking, their blood should be very, very vile. It should be a corrupting kind of blood, because it's still a month should, there are laws about when are this, or their ideas about when the milk of the mother is already good and healthy. And a milk of a new mother is really horrible. So it's a very interesting idea that they would be brought into work. So who are these theories reflecting? But this is where I've got with that. I don't have any more good information about how we can think about who performs the length of the time of purification and how long it is for them. But I will go into finally to the two sources I want to share with you that come from Chronicles. And the first comes from a 14th century chronicle. Right. From a 14th century chronicle by Ramon Montagnard. It appears in a chronicle on account of the birth of Jean III from Mallorca, 1350. And Jean was born to the Infante Ferrando and to the Infanta Isabel in Catania on April 1315. He was baptized in a local cathedral. More than 8 days of festivities celebrated his birth. Over the next days, Isabel was thought to be out of danger enough so that her husband traveled. But he was quickly called to her sickbed once more as she became feverish, not long after she died. These developments had notable consequences in terms of inheritance for the newborn Jean. This is why I think Montagnard writes all this. And maybe I should have said before, to find stories so intimate in chronicles is very, very rare. And when they appear there, it is always for other reasons. Montanel is not interested in purification, neither Alfonso de Palencia, will turn to. We have to read through the sources and kind of pick them and in a nitpicking way to find what they're saying. But so his issue is inheritance and how Matat Grifon would be divided, really to support the king or the prince that he's supporting. For our purposes, though, they offer some clues as to the care of postpartum women. Isabel experienced the short convalescence period in which her husband thought she was well enough that he could leave her side, and in which he was able to confirm her will to bequest the barony of Matat Grifon to her son and husband. The will was contested, and Montanel defended its legitimacy by noting that at the time of writing, Isabel did not know that her mother had previously died, because Ferrando resisted telling her while she was pregnant and until the time she would exida a misa, until the time she would leave for the church. Sadly, Isabel then died, leaving her husband in grief, the Infanta, as it pleased the Lord. Okay, so here I'll just read this. Now it is the truth that it was full 2 months since her mother had died of illness of Matat Grifon, but she knew nothing of it, nor did the Lord Infanta wish anyone to tell her whilst she was pregnant, nor likewise after she had been delivered until she had gone to mass. Sadly, Isabel had then died, leaving her husband in grief. The Infanta, as it pleased God, passed from the life 32 days after the Infanta Anjom, her son, was born. And she died in the arms of the Lord Infante and Ferrando, and he and all the city made greatest mourning ever seen, and with great ceremonies as per one who was pure and who had confessed and received Holy Communion and extreme unction. She was put into a beautiful tomb near the body of the Holy Virgin St. Agatha, and the church consecrated to her in Catania.
We have about 5 to 6 minutes.
Yes, that's fine. I'll be okay. This one chart where we see that there is a time period that really goes back to pregnancy and until after going to church, in which the woman is seen fragile, that no bad news should be brought. And this is one aspect of purification. And then there's another one, which completely does not deal with purity. But in the second chapter, the next chapter, Montanel finds it important to note that she was purified before she was entered into the church. That is one vignette. And another, just to go quickly to the story, is on April 22nd, 1451, the Infanta Isabel, later known as the Isabel de la Católica, was born to King Juan II of Castile and Isabel of Portugal. The birth was successful, and is more often the case than not. We have almost no detail about the birth itself, yet according to one chronicler, the following days were not as expected. Isabel of Portugal, her mother, became sick, then detached and disinterested, wishing to be on her own rather than joining the festivities, celebrating the birth. Here are Alfonso Palencia's words. In the midst of all, one new joy came to lift the king's spirit, since on the 23rd of April, he's wrong here, 1451, his wife gave birth to a daughter, Isabel. Yet as fortune would have it, never among mortals does happiness appear without some burden of bitterness. For after the birth, the young queen suffered an unusual sickness. Suspicious of ill-doing fell on Don Alvaro, and I will spare you all the details of it. They're really amazing. I will just say, I will jump a little bit further. And she was presented with various games and all types of joys and feasts, but still the queen preferred solitude. Only at times the words of her loved consort were able to interrupt her profound silence. The doctors investigated diligent care of the cause of the great sorrows, but they did not find any other cause than poison. And they applied, and slowly she becomes well. Various medications. What is interesting in this story, and you can look at it as I speak if you're curious, is what notes the fact that Isabel isn't right is she's not participating in any of the parties and the celebrations that we're supposed to celebrate her the childbirth. So there is no mention here of purification. She doesn't, there's no mention of her needing to go to the church. But obviously part of the celebration is going to the church, and she was not able to take part in them. There's no sense of time here as well, but there is a sense of a very elongated concept of time for her, because it just goes on, and she's not getting better. I'm sorry, I'm running through it. I want to get to my point. So I want to say a few things. The first is, one of the interesting things about this purification as a practice is that nowhere in all of these texts, almost, there is no specific amount of time. There's no actual time. So in the Pentecost notes, 30 days, but in other texts we have 66 weeks, a month, and this kind of calls to the fact that it's not actual impurity that is at hand. That the question of purification is disconnected to impurity. Another aspect that I want, but at the same time, this vagueness is very important because it's elastic. And when we look at this time and this discussion of time in this text, of the time of purification or the time of the postpartum, without the note of purification there, it is very obvious that it's an indicative moment of the wellness of the mother, whether she's healthy or not. It's a symptom, and it's also indicator for the physician, but it's also a therapy, because managing this time and bringing her back, and here you'll have to believe me because I don't have any more time to bring any more examples. When everything is goes back to normalcy, and just shout Marjorie Kemp, and you can look it up. She goes into the church, and that's how this episode, and that's not Marjorie, it's a woman Marjorie takes care of. When the episode is finalized and she's obvious to everyone that she's well, she does the going to the church. So it is thought of, and this is kind of my suggestion, this kind of purification is not really a concept of purification, it's a kind of a recuperative time, and that's what it means to the people on the ground. Thank you.
So I'd like to open the floor for questions, if I do, and then moving back.
So you say this thing about not actual impurity through recuperation. So just to be clear, how do you define impurity? Are you thinking of something that is material or thought of as material versus something that's moral or spiritual? And then how do you distinguish between what is material and not material?
I don't have a good question. I don't have a good answer.
Because I have exactly the thing for my paper. So
Yeah,
maybe
okay. So I don't have a good answer.
you
I
can solve
don't-
it before I get that.
Thank you. Great question. I don't have a good answer, but I will say, it's definitely, there is a concept of filth that is there, but it's not, the time frame of purification is not attached to it. And there is no sin involved, so it's not moral impurity. And so it hovers in a way. This is why it's so vague. There is no actual essential aspect that you can say this is a spiritual or moral or physical impurity. So I think that's why I think it's less impurity than the act of purification that is interesting, that is important to them, but not in terms of purification, but in terms of going out and coming into the church. So no, that's not a good answer. But I don't know how to explain it better.
I mean, there could be sin, kind of residual sin, like a kind of Eve style sin, without it being the act of the mother.
But it's not in the text.
That's not that.
This is I kind of threw it in somehow. Everyone knows there was a sense of filth, and there was a sense of sin, and there was a sense of, and everyone was doing purification. But the text doesn't speak in that way, and that's what I'm bothered with. You can say that through the sermon, and through the very wide notion that you know, you can read the poem that the idea of going and having sex right after you have a child is a bad thing, but it's not bad because of Eve or because of her, their lasciviousness. It's bad because it doesn't, they're not taking care of their children. So there's, again, it does this explanation that we have kind of ready-made for this. Does that make sense? Yes, please.
I have 3 questions. First of all, thank you. That was very stimulating. The first question has to do with sort of just absorbing what you said. I think once or twice you said something to the effect of purity of blood did not exist. So my question regarding that is when and what do you mean? Arguably, you know, the blood purity concept is present in the early 15th century, before the Toledo revolt. So I don't know. That's number 1.
That's a different kind of blood purity, right?
Okay, so number 2, do you spend? I mean, I think that postpartum is of course a wonderful moment in which to look at questions of pollution. But maybe I can ask you to free associate about how the various discourses of pollution that you identified here form part of a larger, let's say, longitudinal discourse of women's pollution. I'm thinking of a couple of things. Number 1, St. Augustine, right? For whom, you know, women's sexuality is just bad, whether it's, you know, a 5-year-old or a 50-year-old, doesn't matter. And of course, women are constantly, like men, are constantly, you know, sort of expelling life-bearing fluids of all kinds. Also, if there is such a longitudinal discourse, does it transcend religious differences? You made a big emphasis on the question of going to church to become purified. But then I'm thinking about the poem by Anton de Montoro, who is essentially saying that Jews purify their young maidens by having them, you know, cut their fingernails and so forth. Okay, so that's I guess I combine question 2 and 3.
Yeah, wonderful, thank you. So I think it's some methodological questions that you're asking about how I divide my sources from others, and I hope I can do justice, but we can continue later on. I think the Limpieza de Sangre and the idea of blood purity in that sense is very, very different to this kind of purity, which is it's different. It's a different kind of discourse. It would be interesting to see how in the 15th century they collide, but they don't come up here with this question of a woman after childbirth. I mean, there's good reason to look at what did they do in terms of interfaith, and when we have inquisitional sources, what do they do with these practices? But I haven't looked at these kind of sources yet, I don't think we have good one for the 15th. They would come up later on. And I think you're right. So I would put the blood purity aspect a little bit on the side. Please explain to me how you see this connected later on. The religious blood questions deal with something that is both longitudinal and horizontal, right? They occur across time from the ancient period to the 14th, 15th century, and they occur also on the ground. So there's the religious interaction, interreligious interaction in Spain. Of course, this is a very misogynist society. Ideas about women's impurity or pollution or demonology are there. What I find striking in these sources is they don't speak it. When Montaner is describing the woman, he's not saying that she would be harmed with demons. And also in Isabel's story, when Isabel, the mother, she's being poisoned, or she's being some kind of magic is worked upon her. She's not being demonized herself. Who is demonized is Isabel de Luna, is the person who's accused. So in a way, I think when working with these sources closely, we must kind of do there should be a prism that goes into the sources and kind of not forget, but put these what we know about women, the sexism against women, and these ideas to the side, and thinking about how these things are practiced, because what these sources give us is a bit of the day-to-day, and I think in the day-to-day, these big questions find ways to kind of be in the background, but not in the actual practice.
Okay, I think we have two more questions. If I can.
No, it's okay. It's okay. We just have to try to stay a little bit on track. So we have Rob, and then in the back, I'm sorry, I don't know your name, but we have two more. So
Okay, thank you.
yes.
Well, it's all very interesting, and I can assure you, unfortunately, my material is going to be even more shocking than yours in terms of its explicit nature. You can't talk about purity without talking about filth, and my paper will talk quite a lot about filth.
Thank you.
So I always give filthy papers, but but I wanted to know about the presence and absence of blood in the postpartum period, because in the Islamic legal context, not necessarily in Islamic practice, because that varies enormously across different societies. In the legal context, it varies enormously across different schools, but the discourse is very much around the presence or absence of blood is the critical element for purity. So in the postpartum period, if the woman is bleeding, she is not required to pray and she's not required to fast. As soon as bleeding stops, she can commence praying and fasting. It's like the period is finished now. Okay, so that means that the presence and absence of blood is the critical element, not any time period or lapse or any stipulated amount of time. Now, there are maximum amount of times, and that the schools differ over the maximum amount of time, that if blood occurs within this period of time, it's counted as postpartum bleeding. But it's not, but the presence or absence of blood is the critical element in terms of ritual purity law. And that's and that doesn't seem to necessarily resonate so much with your material, which is
Thank you. This is wonderful, because this is exactly the point. There is no discussion of the woman bleeding at all. It doesn't matter.
Okay, I think one final question, then we might go to Robert's paper and we can discuss further. But we have feedback.
Perhaps, I say only perhaps, it is interesting to see this type of school in the debate and in Spain in 60th century about the Immaculate Conception. That I think that in 1585 that is fulfilled the dogma, but the discussion about this is start before, and I think that is a culmination point about the meaning of commission and unity in the world.
Yeah, I think 16th century, I didn't get to it, but 16th century, I think it is really about pollution. And because of the case of the sun, and because of the things that occur in Spain and the Easter celebration, this is a different story. This is here, there is no, maybe I'll just say that. Thank you.
Let's all thank our speaker. And Robert, I think if we finish here by 1:45, we should be okay for lunch, I hope. And yes, so we'll have 30 minutes for your paper and then whatever time left for questions, I think. So I will introduce you while you walk. So Robert Wisniewski is the professor of ancient history at the University of Warsaw. His research focuses on the religious history of late antiquity, especially with regard to Christian divination, the cult of saints and their relics, and the history of the clergy. Robert is also in charge of the Warsaw team of the Cult of Saints in Late Antiquity project, very helpful project if you're interested in that. I use it all the time. And was previously the principal investigator of the project Presbyters in the Late Antique West. He is a chair of the Center for Research on Ancient Civilizations at Warsaw and is now enjoying the blissful toil of a sabbatical
Very
year.
much.
Where he is a visiting professor at the University of Reading, and yes, I think I'll just introduce the paper. So this paper is titled "Dirty Bones and Holy Relics." Let's go.
Thank you very much. And it's really a pleasure to be here. I'm afraid that my presentation will lean toward pollution. And yes, I like the word filth, then toward the past, but I think it fits quite nicely with what Nama presented. So in this paper, I would like to raise the question if late anti-Christianity developed or was developing a concept of pollution or impurity caused by dead bodies. Of course, in a way, you can think that this question is a little bit strange because the idea of bodily resurrection, thanks to this idea, Christianity should have had a generally positive attitude toward human remains. Well, admittedly, the opinions on the nature of this resurrection, rather the nature of the body which was to be resurrected, differed. But in late antiquity, the notion that it was this material corpse, the very flesh from which the body was built in the moment of death, that would be raised from the dead, prevailed. However, it is disputable whether or what impact this idea had on the forms of Christian funeral and burial practices. Well, I know that this is not Christian, but well, anyway, don't pay too much attention on the pictures there, to entertain you. I'm not building on them too much. So Eric Rebier emphasized that at least on the theological ground, the religious interment in a church or cemetery were by no means considered necessary for the resurrection before the before the 4th century. Christian burial practices didn't differ much from those of other inhabitants of the Mediterranean. So the only exception was probably the Christian rejection of cremation, but this probably didn't have much to do with the fear of the disintegrated body would be, less likely to resurrect. And also, the difference was not that sharp, as the cremation was in decline in the imperial period anyway, among everybody. In all, if we can tell apart Christian from non-Christian burials in this period, it is thanks to inscriptions, iconography, or context, and not to a specific form of interment. And it is quite possible that, say, in the 3rd century, someone who witnessed a funeral were in a similar situation, unable to see whether it was Christian or not at the first sight. So I suppose that it is fair to ask whether Christians differed from their neighbors in this respect of their burial practices, which brought us here all together, whether they considered human corpses a source of pollution for a place in which they were buried. In the pre-Constantinian period, there is nothing to suggest so. There's, but I think that in a way, in the pre-Constantinian period, this problem was not fully relevant because the issue of, possible contamination essentially arises when a space which can be contaminated is considered in some way, at least, sacred. And before the 4th century, Christianity obviously didn't have the idea of any religiously special place which should have been somehow protected. This concerns both the macro scale, the broad geographical concept of the Holy Land or the Holy City was not yet there, and a micro scale. So no Christian meeting place, no ecclesia was considered sacred or referred to as hieron or templum. But in the course of the 4th century, the situation changed dramatically. Already in 414, Eusebius of Caesarea, in his sermon on the dedication of the Basilica of Tyre, made a close parallel. He was the first to do so. The parallel between a church building and Jerusalem temple, and used the term Heron when talking about both of them. In the following decades, we can see the swiftly growing idea of the Holy Land and the holiness of the martyrial shrines. And all these types of sanctified space, so biblical places, churches, martyria, and possibly we can add to that monasteries, although in a slightly later period, they interacted with each other. And not everybody agrees in which of them the very idea of the holy place started. But be that as it may, in the later part of the 4th century, Christianity had its sacred places all right. And those which are most common among them were the shrines of the martyrs, either built over their graves or holding their relics. And this brings us back to the problem of the dead bodies. On two levels. Firstly, because the martyrial bodies considered holy by Christians came to be unearthed and brought to or in proximity of the places which were considered sacred by other people. And secondly, because Christian sacred places, especially the martyrial basilicas, started to attract burials of all sorts of people, cleric or lay. I will leave the first problem aside. So just saying that we have good evidence showing that it existed. It suffices to name the Emperor Julian, who ordered to move the body of the martyr Babylas from his newly built shrine, which stood close to the temple of Apollo in Daphne, close to Antioch, and who referred to the pollution caused by Christian tombs in other places in his writings. Slightly later, Eunapius wrote about Christians bringing repugnant monks to Greek sacred places and venerating the bones and skulls, the bones and skulls of the criminals who had been put to death for their numerous crimes. And he added that Christians haunted their sepulchres and thought that they became better by defiling themselves at their graves. So these are just two best known examples. There are also others. So in recent years, some doubts were raised as to whether the dead bodies were really considered causing pollution in the Roman world. And for the Republican and early imperial period, the evidence for this seems indeed meager. But in late antiquity, the situation is quite clear. The idea of pollution caused by mostly Christian dead bodies was there, at least among pagan intellectuals. But leaving this problem aside, I wanted to check. So what I wanted to check was the second problem that I mentioned. That is whether the emergence of Christian holy places, mostly martyrial shrines, was followed by the rise of the idea of pollution which could defile the sacred space in a similar way as the sacralization of Eucharist made it prone to the pollution caused, for instance, by sex. In other words, my question was whether some Christians came to think that the martyrial shrines should be protected against the unholy dead bodies of normal people, the unholy bodies of normal people, which they nevertheless attracted. There is a text, a specific text, which made me ask this question. It comes from the late 5th century collection of miracles of Saint Thecla, and tell us about a noble, oh, sorry, I was here. And tell us about a noble, cultivated, and pious Christian rhetor who wanted to honor his friend, his dead friend, burying him into the shrine of St. Thecla in Seleucia, in his area. he received the permission of the local bishop Maximus, and the grave diggers started their work. But all at once, the martyrs stood before them, rebuking them, accusing them of insolence, striking them with fear, and commanding them to withdraw at once. They didn't realize at first who she was. It was not their lot to comprehend an event so strange and unexpected, but they withdrew nevertheless. After waiting a little while, they got to work again, and again the martyrs stood before them, this time looking at them with a more severe and angry gaze, as is typical of those who are extremely irritated. She immediately knocked the breath out of them so that none of their limbs remained free of shaking and trembling. For the martyr is fearsome, not only when she exercises her strength, but also when she gazes directly at those who might be deserving such a gaze. And she nearly deprived them of their lives, so that other hands would be required for their burial, but she spared them out of respect for Maximus. When she presented herself to Maximus himself during the night, she exhorted him that he should not have been so disdainful of her church as to introduce into it the full smell of mass burials and tombs. There was nothing in common, she said, between tombs and houses of prayer, unless someone who has died is not really dead, but is alive to God, and is worthy to dwell together under the same roof as the martyrs, such as the divine Symposios or Samos, the famous holy man, or someone else of the same quality as they. This is an interesting, well, and picturesque piece of evidence. When talking about the full smell of burials, it uses the rhetoric of pollution, but its interpretation is not easy. The author makes a distinction between the normal dead, who should be buried elsewhere, and special dead, or the holy-ish persons who are actually alive, not dead, and can rest in the martyrial shrine together with the real martyrs. He names specifically two men worthy of such burial, without presenting them any closer, but we know who they were. Symposios was a bishop and Samos an ascetic. Thus, the former represented a sacerdotal, the latter monastic sanctity. But does this mean that the author considered other dead to pollute the place? Well, I would be tempted to say yes, but without being sure, I would probably say no. I would attract your attention to the term polyandrios, the mass burial, which the author uses, which suggests that he was rather concerned about keeping elite, privileged character of the in-shrine burials, and the privilege was to be based on purely ecclesiastical criteria. Monks and clergy are allowed, lay people are not. Nevertheless, I thought it was worth looking for other pieces of evidence which would bring testimony to a similar attitude. And to avoid building too much expectations, I have to say at the outset that I haven't found much which would clearly point to the pollution. But what I found is worth taking a closer look at. So, scene one. Around 390, John Chrysostom preached at the martyrion at the Romanesia gate at Antioch. This was the day of the Ascension, but the specific occasion was the transfer of the relics of a group of unnamed martyrs to a new shrine erected for them by Bishop Flavian. The reason for this was that the old martyrion was also a burial place of some heretics, John doesn't say it, but it must have been Arians who controlled the church of the city in the mid-4th century. And it must have been declared Arians, so probably some clerics. The preacher saying that the sheep should be separated from the wolves and the martyrs fully deserve to have their own lodgings hastens to add this. Of course, even before this moment, the martyrs suffered no harm from the heretics' company in burial. The bodies of those whose spirits are in heaven suffered no harm from what surrounded them. The relics of those whose soul is in the hand of God suffered nothing from their location. Indeed, there was no harm for them, even before this occasion. Our people, however, suffered no mean damage from the place, as on the one hand, they hastened towards the relics of the martyrs, but on the other hand, they said their prayers in doubt and ambiguity, because it was unknown where the burials of the saints were and where the true treasures lay. It was as if flocks of sheep were arriving eager to enjoy a pure stream of water from pure springs, but were turned back by a stench coming from the vicinity. That is precisely what used to happen to this flock. The people walked to the pure springs of the martyrs, but sensing heretical odor coming from the vicinity, they were driven away again. We can find here the same rhetoric as in the miracles of Thecla. When talking about the smell of heresy secreted by the Arian graves, John Chrysostom uses even the same word, dysodia, which in the miracles referred to the smell of the graves of common people. But John takes care to make it clear the martyrs do not suffer any harm, whether they are buried here or there. Their souls are with God in heaven, and their bodies are not polluted by the proximity to Arians. It is the faithful who suffered, as they were confused when they came to drink from a pure spring, but scented the stench of heresy. Thus, the transfer has had a pastoral purpose. It is the community, not the martyrion, which was protected from the pollution of heresy. John's argument resembles the answer which Augustine gave once to the question of whether it was sensible to bury the dead at Sanctus. Essentially, no. Augustine says, as the bodies of saints and other people do not interact with each other in any way, but the practice is justifiable as it brings some comfort to the living and encourages them to pray for the souls of their loved ones. Perhaps this parallel can be pushed even further. Both Augustine and John Chrysostom agree that theologically the specific place of burial is completely unimportant, but they feel that not everybody necessarily shares this view, so they try to justify the practice on pastoral and not doctrinal grounds. Scene 2. In the 360s, Optatus of Miletus, writing against the Donatists, tells about the slaughter of a group of circumceliones by the Roman army in the mid-4th century, somewhere in Mauritania Caesariensis. He claims that the Donatists themselves were to blame for that, obviously, but what interests us is his comment concerning their burial. He says this: when some of them started to be buried in basilicas, Clarus, the presbyter, well, quite apparently Donatist presbyter in Subula, was made by the bishop to have the burial undone. This revealed that what had happened had been ordered to happen, since it was forbidden, it was forbidden even to give them burial in the house of God. So this situation is again a bit unclear. What was the purpose of a burial in a basilica, and why the local, once again apparently Donatist bishop, didn't like it? I think that there are two possibilities. So either the circumceliones were buried as martyrs of the Catholic, or if you prefer, Sicilianist persecution, and the local bishop thought that that was a little bit too far, or they were buried simply in a relatively privileged place, in a funeral basilica. So without being sure, I think that the Doctatus suggests the latter. He doesn't mention any cult, rather emphasizes that the circumceliones were denied what other people did receive, so the burial in the house of God. Thus, if Optatus is right describing this scene, the local bishop found the burial of circumceliones executed by the soldiers unwelcome in the basilica of some local martyrs. But nothing suggests that these burials were considered polluting. They were rather inappropriate. Sorry, I kept giving the numbers to these are the references to the records in the first in the Cult of Saints database, and this is the Presbyteros of the Late Antiquity database, which Angela very kindly mentioned. I'm a little tempted, but it's hyperlinked, but no, I will refrain myself. So the same idea can be found in other sources. The burials in churches are generally all right, but some people should be excluded. And this brings me to St. 3, Gregory of Tours, specialist in punishing miracles, tells us a story of a certain Pelagius who stole pots containing sea urchins from Gregory's men. So that was a serious thing. He swore innocence, so Gregory couldn't do anything about it. But within 4 months, Pelagius was seized by a fever and died. Now, Gregory comments. Pelagius had constructed a tomb for himself in St. Martin's Church in the village of Conde. But when his men went to look at it, they found it broken in pieces. In the end, he was buried in the porch of the same church. The pots, which had contained sea urchins concerning which he had perjured himself, were removed from his storehouse after his death. That was made manifest the miraculous power of the Blessed Mary, in whose church in Tours this miserable liar had proffered his oath. I'm not even 100% sure if Gregory believed that it was the power of St. Martin that destroyed Pelagius' tomb. He doesn't tell about any miracle, but he certainly thought that a perjurer should not lie in a privileged place in a church. So the port was apparently okay. But once again, it was about inappropriateness and punishment rather than pollution. Gregory mentions pollution once when talking about someone who sought sanctuary in the church of St. Martin and was killed there. In result, the place where the relics of the saints were kept were polluted with human blood, but it is quite obviously the double sin, murder and disdain for the sanctuary which caused the pollution, and not the blood itself. The Pelagius and sea urchins evidence is anecdotic, but in the 5th century, there must have been certain hesitation whether those who were excluded from the communion could be buried in sacred places. The Statuta Ecclesiae Antiqua decrees that the dead penitents should be brought to the church and buried there, all right. But this suggests that there were some doubts about it. Much later, in the 13th century, the Decretalium of Gregory IX states that those who bury the excommunicated in a church or cemetery polluted. And the term pollution is used. But even then, so although the phrasing is clear and strong, this is presented as a punishment for the sinners who do not want to repent, rather than a measure taken to protect the holy place against pollution.
Robert, can I just say one thing? So it's 1:30 now, and if you want to wrap up, then
Yeah.
the rest of the time will be for questions. I know we started a bit. late,
Yeah.
but I just wanted
So,
to.
I'm perfectly fine. So, I was looking for the idea of dead bodies polluting Christian holy places, but what I found was the language of pollution used in the context of restrictions concerning burials of heretics, sinners, excommunicated, and lay Christians in martyrial holy places. These restrictions were very material in nature. They told about physical proximity that should be avoided, and they resulted in moving either the bodies or relics away. But in spite of that, in all these cases that I have discussed, the pollution seems to be metaphorical rather than ritual. The presence of unholy bodies did not have an immediate effect. It didn't spoil the holy place or made relics powerless. The language of pollution and smell secreted by the cadavers was employed as an instrument which was to strengthen the doctrinal cohesion of the community, emphasize privileged status of the clergy and monks, and perhaps reinforce their position as moral arbiters. Thus, the phenomenon I have discussed is different than the hard taboo of pollution resulting from the primordial fear of death, both as far as its origin as its function is concerned. But was the idea of pollution in the archaic Athens or in late antique pagan Rome that different? I have already mentioned that the Roman prohibition of burying the dead in the houses seems actually stronger in late antiquity than in earlier period. In Athens, archaeologically, we can see that the graves disappear from among the living quarters only at some point in the 6th century BC. Earlier, they didn't apparently cause any problems. Thus, perhaps after all, the horror of pollution caused by dead bodies was not as primeval and as we often considered it to be. Perhaps, certainly referring to some natural fears, it was always a constructed instrument which expressed expectations, interests, and needs of its time. Thank you for your attention.
So we are over time, but let's do some questions. So so Charles first, and then Ed, and then Muslim.
My question's a quick one, Robert.
Yeah.
About smell. I'm fascinated by the kind of sensory aspects of this, like the kind of the foul smell you mentioned.
Yeah.
But I was also thinking of the sweet smell of the martyrs.
Yes.
And I wondered, and I should know this, but I bet, and I'm sure you do. When do martyrs start to smell nice?
Late 4th century.
Right, okay.
I think that the first attestation that I know comes from here, Jerome's Life of Saint Hilarion, 392.
I concur.
Yeah.
So the question of ignorance, would you connect this to a big picture sort of debate, the debates about the history of Christianity, late antiquity, and so the Gentiles, Christianity is proselytized to the Gentiles, and then in my ignorant assumption, the halakhic legal structures are stripped away, and then they obviously remain in the text, the Hebrew Bible, and then the Christian, sort of Jewish, only Jewish Christians. And so I'm guessing that the people you're talking about are accessing these ideas about pollution from texts, or is there a discourse in your field about I guess, European or Greek sort of pre-Christian pollution ideas that exist and then inform Christianity? What is that? Well, like, what is the big picture about what purity is and how it?
Sure.
Wait,
So-
can I chip in?
Yeah.
Don't you think that the Jewish conception of death as the main source of pollution is also relevant? You hadn't addressed it.
Yes, so I would say, I was thinking about it. So what we have in the background, so are these the Jewish law that they obviously know from the Bible, or is it the idea of impurity, which was perhaps not as strong as we thought, but still existed among Greeks and Romans? And I would say, I think that even if they were aware of the Jewish laws, I think that the fact that the question arises only in the late 4th century, so quite late, suggests that this was not really relevant. So I would say rather that it was, from the pagan side, all the more so as they had to somehow as the Christians had to somehow to react or to address the accusation of making the cities impure, which was raised at the end of the 4th century by people like Julian, and that was probably the most important, by also Eunapius and others. So they had to think about it in this context.
We have a bit of an answer that I can chip in if there's.
There's time.
So this is actually a bit of my paper that I cut out because I didn't have time. So there's a recent-ish Oxford handbook on early Christian ritual that's it discusses a lot of these kinds of comparison across religions based on anthropology. And one of the kind of dominant discourse in there is dividing the function of rituals and therefore pollution based on the categories of religion. And the consensus seems to be that Judaism and Greco-Roman religion, they categorize as ritual pollution versus moral pollution. And then the goal of the purification is to make the person pure before you come close to the divine, whereas, Christianity is kind of this moral. So I think these comparisons are, like they're arguing basically that we should not make those comparisons because their religious structure is so different. So yes, there are influences on practice, over the long run, but that, the way that they're thinking about it is significantly different. So that's kind of what I don't know if that's helpful. But, yeah.
No, absolutely. That was strong, came up strongly in our yearly discussions.
Okay, let's take one final question and then over lunch we can discuss.
Thank you.
Oh, I thought Rob.
I think according to the Jewish law, the situation is quite opposite. It means that the bones of Jewish people are impure, but foreigners, I speak about it now, are not impure.
Okay.
The same mechanism in heaven, because some of the streams in the Jewish law, in the halacha, the mysticism, are trying to say that the bones of holy people are not impure.
Okay,
So it's
interesting. Thank you.
Kind of equal mechanism.
Yeah, interesting. But still, I would say that there is no discussion with that. Although I would say, looking at the in a broad perspective on the Mediterranean, we can see that here and there, the discussion with specific funeral practices exists. Well, there are regions in which people were buried in a different way. I'm thinking about Egypt, so that's probably the most evident thing. But also, if we go east to Iran, or Armenia is a good example. So we can see we have evidence of people stripping the bones of the martyrs out of flesh, burying the flesh in the desert, and taking the pure bones to a church. So it must have been in a dialogue with Zoroastrianism, and it's not really Zoroastrian, because you shouldn't bury the flesh in the desert. But
They didn't have any dogs.
yeah, but the dialogue is quite evident. So what I said, so it is probably a little bit dangerous to give a very general answer. So locally, the discussion probably existed.
I think if it's okay with everybody, we should thank Robert for his great paper, and then our question, and maybe Rob, you can ask your question at lunch. I'm very sorry, but I think many of us are starving, so let's eat us together. But it's not personal.
Oh,
And I'm sorry that I blanked on your name.
No, you could have called me John. It could have been the same.
You're not going anywhere.
I said-
Right out.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, okay, so you were- Alex, totally clear to me, because I'm a video voice. I just,
My mind goes blank more often than it does.
I mean, so I have a bit of face blindness, it's not
Yes,
paralyzingly bad, but I tried to watch an adventure movie, and at some point I said to somebody, I'm like, I get it now. The place from the start, also
Yes.
they don't look great. And that's where the
Yes.
the story is interesting. He said, no, they just look like you.
I know.
And I said, okay, that's.
No, that's fine, funny. Yes, okay.
But no, that's not more, but they do actually look LA, and this, so I brought up the screenshots and.
Okay, to prove you're okay.
Yeah, she said, no, they don't, but. But no, it's not, it's not. It's never- so
I'm well shared, because I think this is people have lots of questions, don't they? There's a very, but you were strict, and that's good, because otherwise we would be hungry.
Oh, yes, you're right. Yes, no, yes, because they say it's separately.
So you were in the almost in reverse, where the bishop is trying to make us say.
Yes. But thank you for reminding me about it, because I had a very vague recollection of the scene, but I never thought about it in the context of, failing attempt to making someone the same. And I'm quite interested in this.
Yeah, you know how, right? Greek Constantine bishop.
I never just.
So he has email me and
Yes,
but he has a book chapter that's called something like George and the Bishop, George and the Camel, I think. And it was that whole episode. Failed attempt.
Even within. Thank you. Can you? Because I will obviously forget what you're telling me. If you send me
I'll write it down and.
Thank you. Let's have some lunch.